Hello everyone, and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now, let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story.
My name is Margaret Sinclair, but everyone calls me Maggie. I've been a park ranger here in the Kentucky mountains for 15 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these hills could throw at me. Bears, flash floods, lost hikers, broken bones. You name it, I've dealt with it. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened at Misty Glen that August. I moved to these mountains after my husband died in Vietnam. I was a nurse back then, working the night shift at Louisville General, but after Tommy's funeral, I couldn't stand being around all that pain and sickness anymore. The mountains called to me, all that quiet, all that peace. Or so I thought. Misty Glen is what we call the crown jewel of our park system. It's a 180-foot waterfall that drops into a deep, dark pool surrounded by slick rocks and moss-covered boulders. The mist from the falls creates this constant fog that hangs in the air, making everything look like a dream. It's beautiful, sure, but it's also dangerous as hell. It takes a 6-mile hike to get there, which keeps the crowds thin, but we still get our share of tourists who don't respect what water can do. I specialize in water rescues, got all the gear, ropes, harnesses, underwater cameras, the works. I've pulled more people out of that plunge pool than I care to count. Most of them are just shaken up, maybe a broken arm or some scrapes, but sometimes the water wins. The Cherokee who lived here first, they had stories about Misty Glen. They called it the place where the crying woman lives. Said a mother lost her child to the falls a long time ago and never stopped looking for him. The old-timers in town still talk about it sometimes, how you can hear her calling his name on quiet nights. Banshees and wailing spirits, I always said. Grief makes people hear things that aren't there. I believed that right up until August 15th, 1984. The call came in just after lunch. A young mother named Sarah Collins and her 5-year-old son Maria had been hiking to the falls that morning. They were supposed to meet Sarah's sister back at the parking area by noon, but they never showed up. The sister waited until 2 o'clock before driving to the ranger station. They're probably just taking their time, I told her. A lot of people lose track of time up there. The mist makes everything feel like another world. But even as I said it, something felt wrong. We'd had heavy rains the week before and the waterfall was running higher than usual. The rocks would be extra slippery and the current in the pool would be stronger. A mother with a small child should have been extra careful. I gathered my gear and headed up the trail. It was a hot day, the kind where the humidity sits on your shoulders like a wet blanket. The closer I got to the falls, the cooler the air became, thick with mist and the sound of rushing water. By the time I reached the viewing area, I could barely see 20 feet in front of me. That's when I heard it. A woman's voice, faint but clear, calling out, "Maria! Maria, where are you?" My heart jumped. If Sarah was calling for her son, that meant they'd gotten separated somehow. I called back, "This is Ranger Sinclair, where are you?" No answer, just the endless roar of the waterfall. I made my way down to the water's edge, testing each step on the slick rocks. The mist was so thick, it was like walking through a cloud. I called out again, but all I heard back was that same voice. "Maria, come to Mama." Something about the way she said it made my skin crawl. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, like it was bouncing off the rocks in ways that didn't make sense. And there was something else. An echo that shouldn't have been there. The waterfall area was open to the sky. There was nothing for a voice to echo off of. I found Sarah's purse first, sitting on a flat rock about 10 feet from the water. It was dry, which was strange considering the mist that coated everything else. Inside was her wallet, car keys, and a few snacks for the hike. No sign of a struggle, no indication she'd slipped or fallen. Then I saw Maria's toy boat floating in a calm eddy near the shore. It was a little red tugboat, the kind kids play with in bathtubs. It bobbed peacefully in the water, completely undamaged. I waded out to get it, and that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The waterfall was running higher than it should be, a lot higher. The flow was so strong it was creating whirlpools in the plunge pool that I'd never seen before, even after the worst storms. But we hadn't had rain in 3 days. I radioed for backup and started my search pattern, working outward from where I'd found their belongings. The mist seemed to get thicker as I moved, until I could barely see my own hands. The sound of the water was deafening, but underneath it, I kept hearing that voice. "Maria! Maria, where are you?" It was getting closer. By the time my backup arrived, the sun was starting to set, and the mist around the falls had taken on an eerie golden glow. Deputy Sheriff Jim Hawkins came up with 2 volunteers from the search and rescue team, Bill Morrison and his son Danny, both experienced hikers who knew these mountains like the back of their hands. "Any sign of them?" Jim asked, slightly out of breath from the climb. I shook my head. Found the mother's purse and the kid's toy, but no trace of them. Water level's higher than it should be, though. Something's not right here. Bill was already setting up the underwater camera equipment. He'd been doing water rescues almost as long as I'd been a ranger, and if anyone could find bodies in that churning pool, it was him. "Maggie," Danny called from near the falls. "You need to see this." I made my way over to where he was standing, about 15 feet from the base of the waterfall. He was pointing at the water. "Look at the current pattern," he said. "See how it's flowing?" I looked where he was pointing and felt my stomach drop. The water was moving in a spiral pattern that made no sense. Instead of the chaotic churning you'd expect from a waterfall this size, the current was organized, almost deliberate, like something was controlling it. "Never seen anything like that," Bill said, joining us with the camera gear. "It's like the water's been arranged." That's when we heard the crying. It started soft, almost like the sound of wind through the trees, but quickly grew louder. It was definitely a woman crying, and it was coming from somewhere behind the waterfall itself. But that was impossible. I'd been back there dozens of times. There was nothing but solid rock. "Sarah!" I called out. "Sarah Collins, can you hear me?" The crying stopped immediately, replaced by that same voice I'd been hearing. "Maria, come to Mama." Jim looked at me with wide eyes. "That's not coming from behind the falls," he said. "That's coming from inside them." Bill lowered the underwater camera into the pool, and we all gathered around the small monitor to see what it would pick up. For a few seconds, all we saw was the usual murky water and swirling debris. Then something white flashed across the screen. "Back it up," I said. "There, right there." Bill rewound the feed and played it in slow motion. Clear as day, we could see something that looked like a person in white clothing moving through the water. But people can't move like that underwater. This figure was gliding, almost floating, without any of the desperate thrashing you'd expect from someone drowning. "Equipment malfunction," Jim said, but his voice shook. "Has to be." Danny was filming the monitor with his own camera when the image suddenly went white. Pure white static filled the screen, and a sound came through the speakers that made us all step back. A wailing cry so full of grief and longing that it seemed to reach right into your chest and squeeze your heart. "Turn it off," I said. Bill fumbled with the controls, but the camera seemed to have a mind of its own. The wailing grew louder, and now we could hear words in it. My baby, where is my baby? Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went quiet. The static disappeared, the wailing stopped, and the camera showed nothing but empty water. "We need more light," Bill said, his face pale. "Whatever's down there, we're going to need better equipment to find it." But as we were setting up the floodlights, Danny grabbed my arm. "Maggie," he whispered, "look." I followed his gaze to the waterfall itself. There, clearly visible through the mist, was the silhouette of a woman. She was tall and thin, wearing what looked like a long, white dress, and she was standing directly behind the falling water. Her long black hair moved in a way that had nothing to do with the wind. She was looking right at us. "Sarah!" I called out, even though I knew it wasn't her. This figure was too tall, and there was something about the way she stood that was all wrong. Too still, too patient. The woman raised her arm and pointed directly at me. When she opened her mouth, that same voice we'd been hearing echoed across the water. "You understand loss. You know what it means to be alone." Ice ran down my spine. How could she know about Tommy? About the baby we never got to have? Jim was already reaching for his radio. "This is Deputy Hawkins requesting immediate backup at Misty Glen. We have a situation here." But before he could finish the call, the woman stepped forward, and I swear to God, she stepped right through the waterfall like it wasn't there. One moment she was behind the wall of water. The next, she was standing on the rocks at the base of the falls, soaking wet but somehow not dripping. "Where is Maria?" she asked, and her voice was like the sound of water over stone, soft but relentless. "I've been calling for so long." That's when I understood. This wasn't Sarah Collins. This was something much older, something that had been here long before any of us. The Cherokee stories my grandfather used to tell came flooding back. La Llorona, they called her in some places. The weeping woman. The mother who lost her child and could never rest until she found him again. But if she was real, then where were Sarah and little Maria Collins? The answer came to me like a punch to the gut. They were already dead, had been dead, since they first arrived at the falls that morning. The woman in white had been calling for her own lost child, not theirs. She'd been calling for over 100 years. The woman in white didn't move like a living person. She glided across the wet rocks without slipping, her bare feet finding purchase where experienced hikers would fall. Her dress was old-fashioned, like something from the 1800s, with long sleeves and a high collar. It should have been heavy with water, but it flowed around her like silk in a gentle breeze. "Ma'am," Jim said, his hand resting on his service weapon, "we're going to need you to stay where you are." She turned to look at him, and I saw her face clearly for the first time. She was beautiful in a terrible way, high cheekbones, dark eyes that seemed to hold all the sadness in the world, and skin so pale it was almost translucent. When she smiled, I noticed her teeth were perfectly white, but somehow too sharp. "You cannot help me," she said. "Only a mother can understand." Her gaze shifted to me, and suddenly I felt like I was drowning in those dark eyes. Images flooded my mind, flashes of a life I'd never lived. A small boy with black hair playing by a river. The same boy slipping on wet stones. The desperate search that lasted days, weeks, months. The slow realization that he was never coming home. The grief hit me like a physical blow. It was deeper than anything I'd ever felt, even when Tommy died. This was the agony of a mother who'd lost her child, multiplied by over a century of searching and finding nothing. "Stop!" I gasped, doubling over as the emotions crashed through me. "Please, stop!" The vision ceased, but the echo of that terrible sadness remained. When I looked up, she was standing directly in front of me, close enough to touch. "You would have been a good mother," she said softly. "I can see it in you." Behind her, the waterfall began to change. The water flow increased again, but now it wasn't just louder, it was different. Instead of the chaotic tumble of water over rocks, it had developed a rhythm, like a heartbeat. And in that rhythm I could hear children's voices calling out in languages I didn't recognize. "Jesus Christ," Bill whispered. "How many kids has she taken?" Danny was backing away slowly, his camera still recording. "We need to get out of here, now." But before any of us could move, the woman raised her hand, and the mist around the waterfall began to swirl. It formed a wall around us, cutting off our view of the trail back to safety. We were trapped in a circle maybe 30 feet across, with her at the center and the supernatural waterfall at her back. "I have been calling for so long," she said, her voice now coming from multiple directions at once. "Maria was here this morning. I felt him near the water. But when I reached for him, he was not my Maria. The implications hit me like ice water. You killed them. You killed Sarah and her son." Her expression didn't change. "They drowned. Children are drawn to water, especially water that calls to them. The mother tried to save him, but the current was too strong. It is always too strong." "You made it too strong," Jim accused, drawing his weapon. "You killed them." She looked at the gun with something like amusement. "Your metal cannot harm what grief has made eternal." To prove her point, Jim fired 3 shots center mass. The bullets passed right through her without leaving so much as a ripple in her form. She didn't even flinch. "I do not kill," she continued as if nothing had happened. "I simply call, and the water answers. Some who come to the water are not strong enough to resist, but I must keep calling. Somewhere my Maria is lost and needs his mother." The mist wall around us began to close in, and I could see shapes moving in it, shadows of other figures, other victims. Men, women, children, all with the same pale, drowned look, all searching for something they'd lost. "How many?" I asked. "Not enough," she replied. "My child is still lost." That's when I realized the horrible truth. She wasn't just some random spirit haunting the waterfall. She was actively hunting, using the falls as bait to draw in families with children. And she'd been doing it for generations. "The Cherokee woman," I said. "From the stories, that's you." She nodded. "I was Ayana. My son was 4 years old when he fell into the river during the spring floods. I searched until winter, then threw myself from these falls to join him in death. But death did not bring us together. Instead, it bound me to this place, forever searching. The water level in the pool continued to rise, and now it was lapping at our feet. But this wasn't normal water. It was ice cold and seemed to move with purpose, curling around our ankles like liquid fingers. Every few years I hear children playing near the water," Ayana continued. "I call to them, hoping one will be my Maria, but they are always someone else's children, and their parents always try to keep them from me." Bill was trying to contact the outside world on his radio, but all he was getting was static. The same wailing static we'd heard through the underwater camera. "The equipment," I realized. "You've been interfering with our equipment all along." "I do not wish to be recorded," she said. "Images trap pieces of the soul. I have so little left." Danny's camera suddenly went dead. The battery drained, despite being fully charged when we arrived. His backup flashlight flickered and went out. One by one, all our electronic equipment was failing. The water was up to our knees now, and I could feel a current trying to pull us toward the falls. But it wasn't random. It was deliberate, intelligent. The spirit was herding us like sheep. "What do you want from us?" I demanded. Ayana's sad smile returned. "I want you to understand. You, who know what it means to lose someone. You, who never had a child but feel the lack like a physical wound. You know what I suffer." She was right. And that's what terrified me most. I did understand. The longing for children Tommy and I had never been able to have. The emptiness that no amount of work or service could fill. The dreams I still had sometimes of little voices calling Mama in voices I'd never heard. "But understanding isn't enough," I said. "You can't keep taking other people's children just because you lost yours." Her expression hardened. "Then find him for me. Find my Maria, and I will rest." The water continued to rise, now reaching our waists. In the distance I could hear new voices, search teams calling our names, but they sounded impossibly far away, like they were coming from another world. "We can't find a child who died over 100 years ago," Jim said, through chattering teeth. The supernatural water was freezing, sapping our strength with every passing moment. "Then you will stay," Ayana replied, "and you will help me call, forever." That's when I saw them, Sarah and Maria Collins. Their bodies were floating just beneath the surface of the supernaturally calm water near the far edge of the pool. They looked peaceful, like they were sleeping, but their skin had that waxy pallor of the drowned. "They're over there," I said, pointing. "The people you're looking for. They're over there." Ayana followed my gaze and shook her head sadly. "Not my Maria. Another mother's child lost to the water that calls so sweetly." The water reached our chests and I could feel the current getting stronger. Soon it would be strong enough to pull us under, to drag us down into that dark pool where we'd join the Collins family in death. But as I looked at the spirit's face, twisted with centuries of grief and madness, I realized something important. She wasn't evil, exactly. She was just a mother who had been separated from her child for so long that she'd forgotten how to be anything else. And maybe, just maybe, that meant she could be reasoned with. If I could find the right words. The water was up to our necks now, and I could feel my feet losing contact with the rocky bottom. Jim was struggling to keep his head above the surface, and Danny had gone completely pale from the supernatural cold. Bill was trying to swim toward the edge of the pool, but the current kept pulling him back toward the center. "Ayana," I called out, fighting to keep my voice steady. "I need to tell you something about your son." The spirit's attention snapped to me, and for a moment, the rising water stopped. "You know of Maria?" "I know what happened to children who fell into rivers back then," I said. "And I think you do too, deep down. You've just been too afraid to accept it." Her eyes narrowed dangerously. "He's lost. I must find him." "No," I said, as gently as I could. "He's not lost. He was never lost." The mist around us began to swirl faster, and Ayana's form became less solid, more like smoke. When she spoke, her voice carried the full force of a century's worth of rage and denial. "You lie! He fell into the water. I searched, but could not find his body." "Because someone else found it first," I pressed on, even as the water began rising again. "Think, Ayana, really think it was spring flood season. There would have been search parties, other Cherokee looking for a lost child. What happened to children who drowned in those days?" For a moment, her face showed confusion instead of just grief. The water stopped rising again. I searched alone. The others tried to stop me, said it was too dangerous." "They found him, didn't they?" I said softly. "While you were still searching downstream, they found his body upstream. They buried him according to your people's customs, with honor, with love. Ayana's form flickered like a candle in the wind. No, I would have known. A mother would have felt it. You did feel it, I said. That's why you threw yourself from the falls. Not because you couldn't find him, but because you knew he was gone and couldn't bear to live without him. You chose to follow him into death. But then why? Her voice was barely a whisper now. Because death separated you, I explained. Children who die young,
they don't linger here. They move on to whatever comes next. But your grief was so strong it chained you to this place, trapped you in the moment of loss. Your son has been at peace for over 100 years. You're the one who's been lost. The supernatural mist began to thin, and I could see confusion and horror dawning on Ayana's face as my words sank in. The water level started to drop rapidly, as if someone had pulled a cosmic drain plug. "All this time," she whispered. "All these families." "You were looking for him in the wrong place," I said. "And in the wrong time." The spirit doubled over as if in physical pain, and the temperature around us plummeted. Ice began forming on the surface of the water, and when she looked up, her eyes were wild with a century of accumulated anguish. "What have I done?" she wailed. "What have I become?" The waterfall itself began to change, the steady flow becoming erratic and violent. Chunks of ice started falling from above, crashing into the pool with sounds like breaking glass. The rocks around us groaned and shifted, as if the earth itself was responding to her emotional breakdown. "You became a mother who couldn't let go," I said, trying to project calm despite the chaos erupting around us. "But it's not too late to choose differently. The families I've destroyed." Her form was becoming more and more unstable, sometimes solid, sometimes translucent. "The children I've taken from their parents. How can there ever be forgiveness for what I've done?" That's when I understood what I needed to do. It wasn't enough to tell her the truth about her son. She needed something more. She needed to feel what it was like to be a mother protecting children instead of taking them. "Help me save them," I said, pointing toward where Sarah and Maria Collins's bodies were floating. "Help me bring them home to their family. Let them have the proper burial you never got to give your son." Ayana's eyes followed my gesture, and for the first time in over a century, I saw something other than selfish grief in her expression. I saw compassion. I can't bring them back," she said. "No, but you can help me get them to shore. You can do for them what you would have wanted someone to do for Maria. You can help them find peace." The spirit moved toward the bodies, her movements uncertain for the first time since we'd seen her. When she reached them, she hesitated, her hands hovering over Sarah's still form. "I don't remember how to be gentle," she admitted. "Yes, you do," I said. "Motherhood doesn't leave you, even in death. It just gets buried under all the pain." Slowly, carefully, Ayana lifted Sarah's body in her arms. The action seemed to cost her tremendous effort, as if she was fighting against her own nature. But she managed it, cradling the dead woman like a sleeping child. "She tried to save him," Ayana observed, looking down at Sarah's face. "She died,
trying to reach her child." "Just like you did," I said. Tears began flowing down the spirit's cheeks, the first genuine tears she'd shed in over 100 years, I suspected. As each drop hit the water, the supernatural disturbances around us calmed a little more. Together we brought Sarah and little Maria to the shore. Ayana handled their bodies with a reverence that spoke of remembered motherhood, remembered love. When we laid them gently on the rocks, she knelt beside them and began to sing, a Cherokee lullaby in a language I didn't understand, but somehow felt in my bones. "Now they can rest," she said, when the song ended. Now their family can say goodbye. The mist around the waterfall was dissipating, and I could see flashlight beams in the distance. The search teams were finally able to reach us. "What about you?" I asked. "Can you rest now?" Ayana looked up at the waterfall, then back at me. "I've been a guardian of the wrong kind for so long. Maybe I could learn to be a different kind. A protector instead of a hunter." "Your son," I said gently. "Can you feel him now? Can you feel that he's safe?" She closed her eyes and was still for a long moment. When she opened them again, there was peace there for the first time. "Yes," she whispered. "He's been safe all along. He's been waiting for me to remember that love doesn't chain. It frees." The spirit began to fade, becoming translucent in the moonlight. But before she disappeared entirely, she reached out and touched my hand. The contact was ice cold, but somehow comforting. "Thank you," she said, "for helping me remember who I was meant to be." And then she was gone, dissolved into the mist like morning fog before the sun. The official report called it a tragic drowning accident. Sarah and Maria Collins had slipped on the wet rocks near Misty Glen Waterfall and been swept into the plunge pool during a period of unusually high water flow. The elevated water level was attributed to recent heavy rains and underground spring activity, perfectly reasonable explanations that satisfied the county coroner and the insurance investigators. Jim, Danny, Bill, and I all agreed to keep the supernatural details to ourselves. Who would have believed us anyway? And more importantly, what good would it have done? Sarah's sister had enough grief to deal with without adding ghost stories to the mix. But changes came to Misty Glen in the weeks that followed. I pushed for and got approval to install a much more comprehensive warning system, signs in multiple languages, safety barriers at the most dangerous spots, and emergency communication equipment for hikers who got into trouble. The Park Service wasn't thrilled about the expense, but they couldn't argue with my safety concerns. The waterfall itself seemed different too, though I was probably the only one who noticed. The flow became more predictable, following seasonal patterns instead of the erratic surges we'd experienced before. The rocks stayed dry longer after rains, giving visitors better footing. And the mist that had once made visibility so dangerous now seemed to clear at crucial moments, as if something was looking out for people instead of hunting them. There were no more mysterious drownings at Misty Glen. Not that summer, not in the years that followed. Hikers still had accidents, broken bones from falls, cuts from sharp rocks, the occasional case of exhaustion or dehydration. But no more families disappeared into the pool. No more children were drawn to the water by voices that shouldn't have been there. Sometimes, late in the evening when I was doing my final patrol of the area, I'd catch a glimpse of a figure in white standing near the waterfall. But instead of the menacing presence Ayana had been, this felt protective, watchful, a guardian spirit in the truest sense. I started volunteering with the county's youth programs after that summer, reading to kids at the library, helping with camping trips for underprivileged families, teaching water safety at the community center. I told myself it was just civic duty, but the truth was more complicated. Ayana's touch had left something behind, not the crushing grief she'd carried for over a century, but an echo of what she'd been before tragedy twisted her love into something dark. A taste of motherhood that I'd never experienced but somehow now understood. The Cherokee elders I spoke with weren't surprised when I carefully shared an edited version of what had happened. Sometimes spirits get confused, one old man told me. They forget their purpose and start causing the very problems they were meant to prevent. Sounds like she remembered herself just in time. Will she stay peaceful? I asked. He smiled and shrugged. Spirits do what they need to do, but a mother protecting children instead of taking them? That's the natural order. That's what she was always supposed to be. On quiet nights at the waterfall, when the moon is full and the mist catches the light just right, visitors sometimes report hearing a woman's voice. But it's not the desperate crying that hikers use to describe. Instead, they hear someone singing, Cherokee lullabies that seem to come from the water itself, beautiful and calming, like a mother singing her children to sleep. The thing is, I know those songs now. Sometimes I catch myself humming them when I'm alone on the trails, and the melody seems to make the forest feel safer, more welcoming. It's like Ayana found a way to share the protective love she'd remembered with anyone willing to listen. I never married again, never had children of my own, but I learned something important in those terrible hours by the waterfall. There are many ways to be a mother, many ways to protect and nurture. And sometimes the most important thing a mother can do is know when to let go. 3 years later, I was promoted to head ranger for the entire district. They said it was because of my safety innovations at Misty Glen, the way I'd turned one of our most dangerous attractions into one of our safest. They were right, in a way, just not in the way they thought, because the real safety didn't come from warning signs or emergency equipment. It came from understanding that some protectors never stop protecting, even in death. They just need to be reminded of who they're supposed to be protecting and why. Water's still the most dangerous thing in these mountains. But now I know it can be the most protective thing too, when it's guided by love instead of loss. And late at night, when I'm alone with my thoughts and the endless sound of falling water, I sometimes whisper, "Thank you, Ayana, thank you for remembering." The mountains always whisper back. My name is Jacob Thornfield, and I've been a park ranger for 16 years. Most folks who've never worked underground don't understand the weight of earth above your head. How it presses down on you makes every breath feel borrowed. But I know caves better than most men know their own backyards. Had to learn them after what happened to my father in the coal mines. Devil's Hollow sits 22 miles from the nearest town in Monongahela National Forest. It's a limestone cave system that drops 300 feet straight down into the mountain's belly. The Cherokee used to call it sacred ground, but white folks started exploring it in the 1800s. Some of them never came back out. I never believed in the old stories. Thought cave-ins and gas pockets explained the missing folks. Been down in Devil's Hollow maybe 50 times over the years, mapping passages, checking for rockfall, doing standard safety surveys. It's just stone and water and darkness, same as any other cave. That was before October of 1973. My daughter Emma was 15 then, 3 years after her mother died in that car accident. Emma was everything to me, smart as a whip, brave as her mama, with the same green eyes that could see right through my lies when I pretended work didn't scare me sometimes. She was on a school camping trip that week, staying at the campground near Devil's Hollow with her geology class. The call came in on a Tuesday morning. 3 teenage boys had gone into the restricted cave system around sunset the day before. Hadn't come back out. Their parents were frantic, and the local sheriff wanted our cave rescue team assembled fast. I knew those boys, Billy Matthews, Tommy Chen, and little Davy Roberts. Good kids, mostly. Billy was the ringleader type who probably convinced the others to sneak past the warning signs. They'd been missing 18 hours when I got the call. Standard protocol was simple. We'd go in with full rope rescue gear, carbide lamps, emergency oxygen, the works. I knew every mapped passage in that cave system by heart, had the blueprints memorized from years of geological surveys. 3 lost teenagers should have been a routine recovery. Should have been. I was checking my gold line rope and wheat lamp when the radio crackled to life. Static filled the ranger station, but underneath it, I heard something that made my skin crawl. It sounded like singing, not human singing, something else, something that echoed up from deep underground. Must be interference, I told Jenny Walsh, my partner. She was new to cave rescue, but solid, reliable. Radio waves bounce funny off limestone, but the singing kept going, low and haunting, like a hymn being played backward. That should have been my first warning. We rappelled down into Devil's Hollow at noon, me and Jenny and Rick Oakley, a junior ranger who knew the cave system pretty well. The main entrance is a natural sinkhole that opens like a mouth in the forest floor. Limestone walls drop straight down for 50 feet before opening into the cathedral chamber. Everything seemed normal at first. Our carbide lamps threw dancing shadows on the familiar rock formations. The air was cool and damp, maybe 60 degrees like always. We followed standard procedure. Set up communication relay points every 100 feet, checked our equipment twice, kept our rope signals clear and simple. Then my compass started spinning. 50 feet into the main passage, the needle just went crazy, spinning in circles like we were standing on the North Pole. I'd never seen anything like it in 16 years of cave work. "That's weird," Rick said, checking his own compass. "Same thing, spinning wildly with no fixed direction." "Must be iron deposits in the rock," I told them, though I'd mapped this section a dozen times and never seen any magnetic anomalies. "We'll navigate by landmarks." But the cave felt wrong. The temperature had dropped maybe 20 degrees below normal, and our breath came out in little puffs of vapor. No geological reason for it to be that cold. The limestone here was stable, no underground streams that might carry cold air from deeper chambers. We pushed deeper, following the main passage toward the back chambers where the boys most likely got lost. Our rope signals got confused somewhere around the 100-foot mark. Jenny would tug twice for all clear, but I'd feel 3 tugs on my end. Rick reported feeling signals nobody sent. "Rope's playing tricks," I said, though my hands were shaking a little. Friction against the rock changes how the tugs feel. That's when we found the backpacks. 3 school backpacks arranged in a perfect circle around an underground pool I'd never seen before, not scattered like kids dropped them in a hurry, arranged, neat and precise, like someone had placed them there on purpose. The pool was maybe 10 feet across, filled with the clearest water I'd ever seen. So clear you could count the pebbles on the bottom, even though my lamplight showed it went down at least 30 feet. Steam rose from the surface, which was impossible. The cave temperature was too cold for warm water. "Billy? Tommy? Davy?" I called out. My voice echoed strangely, coming back with extra syllables I hadn't spoken. No answer. We searched the area around the pool, looking for any sign the boys had been there. Jenny found something that made her stop dead in her tracks. "Jacob," she whispered, "look at these scratches." Claw marks scored the limestone wall beside the pool, deep gouges that went up maybe 8 feet high, too high for any human to reach, too regular for natural formation. The marks were fresh, limestone dust still scattered at the base of the wall. "Cave bear," I said quickly, though I knew better. No cave bears in West Virginia, hadn't been any for over a century. And the scratches were wrong somehow, too deliberate, like someone had carved a message in a language I couldn't read. Our radios crackled with static, but underneath the white noise we all heard it, that same singing from the ranger station, closer now, echoing from somewhere deeper in the cave system. And then Jenny screamed. She was pointing across the pool, her lamp beam shaking. "There! Did you see it?" A pale figure, tall as a man but wrong in every other way, had been standing in the passage on the far side. just for a second, long enough for her light to catch it before it melted back into the darkness. "Just shadows," I said, but my voice cracked a little. "Light plays tricks underground." Rick was backing toward the entrance, eyes wide. "We should get help. Call in more rangers, maybe some spelunkers who know these back passages." I checked my watch. The hands were moving backward. That's when I knew we weren't dealing with lost teenagers anymore. We should have left right then, should have rappelled back up to the surface and called for backup. But those were good kids down there, and I couldn't abandon them. Besides, I told myself, there had to be a rational explanation. Compass interference, temperature inversions, trick of the light. Caves do strange things to your mind after a while. The passage beyond the pool wasn't on any of my survey maps. It opened like a doorway in the limestone, perfectly round and smooth. Warm air flowed from somewhere deep inside, carrying a smell like old bones and wet earth. Our lamps barely penetrated the darkness beyond. "This should be solid rock," I whispered, running my hand along the smooth stone walls. I mapped this section myself. There was no passage here. But there it was, wide enough for 3 men to walk side by side, sloping down into the mountain's heart. And from somewhere far below, we could hear voices. Not singing this time, talking, young voices, scared and lost. "Billy, that you?" I called into the tunnel. "Help us," came the reply, faint and echoing. "We can't find the way out." Jenny grabbed my arm. "Jacob, something's wrong here. We need to—" Her words cut off as my carbide lamp flickered and dimmed. The flame was blue instead of yellow, and despite a full fuel tank, the light was failing. Rick's lamp did the same thing. Jenny's flashlight went dead completely. In the growing darkness, we heard footsteps. Slow, measured steps coming up from the deep tunnel. Not the quick, panicked sounds of lost teenagers. These footsteps were heavy, deliberate. Something big was walking toward us through the darkness. "Back to the entrance," I whispered. "Now!" But when we turned around, the passage we'd come through was gone. Solid limestone wall where the tunnel should have been, like the mountain had sealed itself behind us. Jenny's voice came out high and tight. "Jacob, how is that possible?" I ran my hands over the rock face. Smooth limestone, no cracks or openings. But I'd mapped every inch of this chamber. The passage had to be there. The footsteps were getting closer. And then we saw them. 3 figures emerged from the deep tunnel, pale as moonlight and tall as basketball players. They moved wrong, like their joints bent in places human joints don't bend. No eyes that I could see, just smooth white skin where faces should be. But they knew exactly where we were. One of them opened its mouth and made a sound like rocks grinding together. The noise echoed off the cave walls and spelled out words in my head. "Leave!" I grabbed Jenny and Rick, pulling them toward the pool. "The water, maybe there's another way out through the water." But Rick was staring at something behind us. "The kids," he whispered. "Oh God, look at the kids." Billy, Tommy and Davy stood with the pale figures. But they were changing. Their skin had turned white as chalk and their eyes were gone. Just smooth skin where their faces used to be. They moved with that same wrong-jointed walk, turning their heads toward us with unnatural precision. "We don't hurt," Billy said, but his voice sounded like stones falling. "It's better down here. You should stay with us." The pale figures, I started thinking of them as hollow dwellers, began moving toward us, not fast, but steady and unstoppable. One of them opened its mouth and let out a sound like a cave-in, a rumbling that made the whole chamber shake. Limestone dust rained from the ceiling. That's when I heard Emma's voice from the surface, far above. "Dad! Dad, where are you?" My little girl was up there somewhere, probably looking for me at the cave entrance. And these things, whatever they were, weren't going to let us leave. The chamber began to flood. Water poured from cracks in the ceiling, rising fast around our ankles. The hollow dwellers didn't seem to mind, but we'd drown in minutes if the water kept coming. "The pool," I said. "We have to try the pool." As we splashed toward the clear water, I saw something that made my blood freeze. Cherokee bone artifacts were arranged around the bottom of the pool in perfect patterns, a burial site. We'd disturbed a sacred burial site. The eldest hollow dweller, bigger than the others, spoke directly into my mind. I saw images of Cherokee warnings, of white settlers who ignored the old taboos, of what happened to people who disturbed the pale ones who guard the sacred caves. The boys hadn't been taken, they'd been transformed, turned into guardians like the creatures that had been protecting this place for hundreds of years. And now it was our turn. The water was up to our waists and rising fast. In the wavering light of our dying lamps, the hollow dwellers looked like ancient statues come to life. Their eyeless faces turned toward us with perfect coordination, as if they shared one mind. The biggest one, I thought of him as the Alpha, stepped into the flooding chamber without making a ripple. When he spoke, the words appeared in my head like they'd always been there. "You have disturbed the sacred rest. The boys paid the price willingly. They understand now. They guard the deep places with us." Billy stepped forward, his transformed face eerily calm. "It doesn't hurt, Mr. Thornfield. We can feel everything through the stone now. Every footstep on the mountain, every breath of wind through the trees. We're part of something bigger." I looked at what had been 3 normal teenagers just 2 days ago. Their white skin seemed to glow with its own light, and they moved through the rising water like they belonged in it, like they'd never been human at all. "Let us go," I said out loud, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "We didn't know this was sacred ground. We came to help those boys." The Alpha tilted his head, and I heard Emma calling again from somewhere far above. Her voice was getting closer to the cave entrance. "Your offspring seeks you," the Alpha said. "She carries the old blood, Cherokee ancestors in her line. We can smell it." My heart stopped. Emma's mother had been part Cherokee, though she'd never talked about it much. Just stories her grandmother told about the old ways, the sacred places in the mountains. "Emma has nothing to do with this," I said. "She does now." The Alpha gestured, and the cave entrance above us began to seal itself. I could hear limestone grinding against limestone, the opening getting smaller. Emma's voice became muffled, then distant. "Dad, the cave is closing! Dad, where are you?" Rick was shoulder-deep in water now, struggling to stay afloat. Jenny had found a ledge to stand on, but it wouldn't be above water much longer. I had maybe 3 minutes before we all drowned. "Take me instead," I said to the Alpha. "Leave my partner and Rick alone. They're good people. They were just trying to help." The Alpha considered this. "You offer yourself freely?" "Yes, but let them go and leave my daughter alone." "You do not understand. We do not take. We transform. We offer purpose. The boys chose to become guardians because they saw the truth. The mountain is dying. Surface people poison the water, cut the trees, strip the coal. Someone must protect what remains." He was right, and I knew it. The mining companies had been carving up these mountains for decades. The streams ran orange with runoff, and half the forest was clear-cut stumps. Maybe the Cherokee had been right to protect places like this, but Emma didn't deserve to pay for our mistakes. "There has to be another way," I said. The Alpha stepped closer, and I felt his thoughts pressing against my mind. Images flashed through my consciousness. Centuries of Cherokee ceremonies in this cave, white settlers ignoring sacred boundaries, the slow death of the mountain ecosystem, and underneath it all, a deep sadness that went back generations. Then I remembered something my father used to sing when I was small. A Cherokee song his grandmother had taught him about making peace with the spirits of the deep places. The words came back to me like they'd been waiting all my life. I started to sing. It was an old peace song, one that acknowledged the sacred nature of the earth and asked forgiveness for disturbances caused by ignorance. My father's voice seemed to join mine, carried up from whatever place the dead go when their work is done. The alpha stopped moving, all the hollow dwellers stopped moving, the water stopped rising, and for the first time since we'd entered the cave, I felt hope. The peace song worked because it was true. I meant every word about respecting the sacred places, about understanding our responsibility to protect what remained of the old world. The alpha listened to the whole song, his eyeless face turned toward me like he could see something in my heart. When I finished, he nodded once. "You carry the old wisdom. This is acceptable." The water began to drain away, disappearing into cracks in the limestone floor that hadn't been there before. Jenny and Rick coughed and gasped as they found solid ground again. Above us, I could hear the cave entrance grinding open. "The boys?" I asked. "Will remain. They chose this path, but they will be honored guardians, not prisoners." Billy stepped forward one last time, and for just a moment I could see the kid he'd been in his transformed features. "Tell our parents we're okay, Mr. Thornfield. Tell them we're protecting something important." The hollow dwellers melted back into the limestone walls like they'd never been there at all. The boys went with them, walking into solid stone and disappearing. But I could feel them somehow, like a presence in the mountain itself. We made it back to the surface just as the search and rescue teams arrived. Emma was there waiting, tears streaming down her face. She hugged me so tight I thought my ribs might crack. The official report said the boys had fallen into an unmapped sinkhole that subsequently collapsed, sealing their bodies inside. Geological instability. The cave system was declared dangerous and permanently sealed. But that's not the whole truth. I requested a transfer to cultural liaison work, spending my time learning Cherokee language and customs from the tribal elders, who still remembered the old stories. They weren't surprised when I told them what really happened in Devil's Hollow. "The Pale Ones have been there since the beginning," old Joseph Crow Feather told me. "They're not evil, they're guardians, but they don't understand the difference between people who respect the sacred places and people who just take what they want." Sometimes, when I drive past the sealed cave entrance, I can see lights moving deep underground. Phosphorescent glows that pulse like heartbeats. Emma sees them too. She's studying geology now, preparing to become the kind of ranger who protects sacred places instead of just managing them. The boys' families eventually found peace with what happened. Not the official story, but the truth I told them quietly, privately. Their sons had become something important, something necessary. In a world where we've forgotten how to respect the old wisdom, maybe that's the kind of transformation we need. I never go underground anymore, don't need to, but I keep my father's Cherokee peace song ready just in case, because there are other caves in these mountains, other hollow places that hunger for guardians. And sometimes, late at night when the wind blows just right, I can hear them calling. Some places aren't meant for surface folks, the Cherokee tried to warn us. Now I spend my time making sure people listen to those warnings, because the alternative is becoming something else entirely, something that lives in the deep places where the earth keeps its oldest secrets, something that guards the hollows that hunger. My name is Catherine Ashford, but everyone calls me Kate. I've been a park ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains for 11 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these old hills could throw at me. Bears, lost hikers, flash floods, you name it. But I was wrong. Dead wrong. Most folks don't know their family history, past their grandparents. Me? I can trace my roots back to the first settlers who carved homes out of these mountains. In the 1840s, my great-great-grandmother, Mary Ashford, was born right here on Ravens Ridge, back when it was still a real town with real people living real lives. That November morning started like any other. The first snow had fallen the night before, dusting the peaks white and making the whole world look clean and new. I was heading up to Ravens Ridge to do some historical survey work. The Park Service wanted to put together a display about the old settlements, and I'd volunteered to document what was left of the place. The hike to Ravens Ridge isn't for beginners. 8 miles on an unmarked trail that winds through thick forest and over rocky ground. No cars can get up there, never could, even back in the day. That's part of why the settlement died out so fast when trouble came. I'd made this hike dozens of times before. Every ranger knows the old settlements, especially one like Ravens Ridge. In 1847, scarlet fever hit the place like a hammer. 47 people died in 3 weeks. The survivors packed up and left, and the mountain took the town back. Now all that's left are some stone foundations, a crumbling cemetery, and the ruins of an old church. Or so I thought. As I climbed the final ridge that morning, something felt off. The woods were too quiet. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering in the trees. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I told myself it was just the snow, the way it muffles sound and makes everything feel distant. Then I heard it. Bong, bong, bong. Church bells, clear as day, ringing out across the ridge in slow, measured tolls. I stopped dead in my tracks and listened. The sound was coming from the direction of the old settlement, echoing off the mountain walls like it was bouncing around inside a giant bowl. I checked my watch. 3 in the afternoon, broad daylight, and there wasn't a working church within 15 miles of Ravens Ridge. I picked up my pace, my boots crunching through the snow. The bells kept ringing as I climbed, that slow, heavy rhythm that makes your chest feel tight. I knew that sound. It was a funeral toll. 1 ring for each year of the dead person's life. I'd heard it plenty of times in the valley churches below. But who was being buried up here? The bells stopped just as I crested the ridge and saw the settlement spread out below me, or what was left of it. Stone foundations poking up through the snow like broken teeth. The cemetery with its tilted headstones, and at the far end, the skeleton of the old church, its walls still standing, but the roof long gone. Everything looked normal, empty, dead. I set up my equipment near the church ruins and got to work. I had my camera, my measuring tools, and a thick folder full of genealogical records I'd pulled from the county archives. The plan was to map out where each building had stood and match them up with the historical documents. But I kept thinking about those bells. I walked over to where the church bell tower had been. Nothing left but a pile of stones where it had collapsed years ago. No bell, no rope, no way for anything to make that sound. Atmospheric conditions, I said out loud, just to hear my own voice. Sound carries funny in the mountains. Could be echoes from the valley churches. It sounded reasonable when I said it, but my skin was crawling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the empty windows of the ruined church. As the afternoon wore on, I lost myself in the work. Measuring foundations, taking pictures, cross-referencing my maps with the old records. The Ashford family plot was right where the documents said it would be. a small section of the cemetery with 5 headstones, including one for a baby who died just days after birth. I knelt down and brushed snow off the largest stone. William Ashford, I read aloud, 1802 to 1847, beloved husband and father. My great-great-great-grandfather. He died in the scarlet fever outbreak along with his wife and 3 of their children. Only little Mary had survived, taken in by relatives in the valley below. The temperature was dropping fast as the sun got lower. I could see my breath and my fingers were getting numb even through my gloves. Time to pack up and head back down. That's when I heard the bells again. This time they were louder, clearer, like someone was standing right next to me ringing them in my ear. The same slow funeral rhythm. I counted the tolls automatically, the way you count thunder after lightning. 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. They stopped at 47. 47 tolls, 47 people who died in the outbreak. I stood there in the growing darkness, surrounded by their graves, and felt ice water run down my spine. I should have left right then, should have packed my gear and headed down the mountain while I could still see the trail. But I'm stubborn, always have been. And I had a job to do. Besides, there had to be a logical explanation. There always was. I set up my camp stove and made some hot coffee, warming my hands around the metal cup. The smart thing would be to come back tomorrow with more equipment, maybe bring another ranger along. But the weather forecast called for heavy snow, and it might be weeks before I could get back up here. So I stayed. The bells didn't ring again as the sun set, but other things started happening. Little things at first. My compass needle wouldn't hold steady. It kept swinging back and forth like it couldn't find north. My digital watch, which had always kept perfect time, started running slow, and the temperature seemed to drop in patches like I was walking through invisible pockets of winter air. I told myself it was the elevation. The mountains can play tricks on your equipment. Magnetic fields from iron ore deposits in the rock. Perfectly normal. But normal didn't explain what I found when I went to set up my tent. There were flowers on one of the graves, fresh flowers, wild flowers that had no business blooming in November, lying on the snow-covered mound like someone had just placed them there. The grave belonged to a child, Emily Ashford, aged 8 years, taken too soon by fever. Another one of my relatives, another child who died in the outbreak. I picked up one of the flowers. It was warm to the touch, and when I brought it close to my face, it smelled like spring rain and sunshine, like life in the middle of all this death. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing off the mountains. "Is someone there?" Nothing answered but the wind in the trees. I made camp near the church ruins, figuring the stone walls would block some of the wind. As I rolled out my sleeping bag, I kept looking over at that grave with the flowers. They seemed to glow in the moonlight, too bright and too colourful for this dead place. Around midnight I heard footsteps, not boots on snow or leaves rustling in the wind, actual footsteps, light ones, like a child running through the cemetery. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam across the headstones, but there was nothing there, just shadows dancing between the graves. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard singing. A child's voice, high and sweet, singing an old lullaby I remembered from my grandmother's house. The same song she used to sing when I was scared and couldn't sleep. Sleep now, my darling. Close your eyes tight. The angels are watching through the long night. Sleep now, my baby. Don't you cry. Mama will love you until she dies. The voice was coming from everywhere and nowhere, like the mountain itself was singing. I followed the sound through the cemetery, my flashlight beam jumping from stone to stone. The singing led me to the back corner, where the smaller graves were clustered together. Children's graves. Dozens of them. That's when I saw her. a little girl in a white nightgown, standing next to one of the headstones. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with long dark hair that hung loose around her shoulders. She was looking right at me, and her eyes were the saddest thing I'd ever seen. "Emily," I whispered. She smiled, just a little, and pointed to something at my feet. I looked down and saw a piece of paper stuck under a rock. Old paper, yellowed with age, covered in a child's careful handwriting. I picked it up with shaking hands and read, "My
name is Emily Ashford, and I am 8 years old. Tomorrow is my birthday, but I don't think I will see it. The fever is very bad, and Mama says I must be brave. I want to tell someone that I was here, that I was real. Please don't forget me." When I looked up, the little girl was gone, but she'd left something behind, more flowers scattered across all the children's graves. And in the distance, growing stronger by the minute, I could hear the sound of church bells ringing. This time, they didn't stop. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that little girl's face. Emily, my cousin, 5 generations removed, dead for over 100 years, but somehow still here, still waiting. By morning, the flowers on the graves had multiplied. Every headstone in the cemetery was decorated with them. Roses, daisies, forget-me-nots, all blooming impossibly fresh in the November snow. And there were toys too. Old-fashioned dolls, wooden hoops, marbles scattered like tears across the frozen ground. I should have been terrified. Any sane person would have run down that mountain as fast as their legs could carry them. But I'm not most people. I'm a ranger, trained to document and investigate, and more than that, these were my family. My people. They'd been forgotten for over a century, erased from history except for a few lines in dusty record books. Maybe they just wanted to be remembered. I spent the morning photographing everything, the flowers, the toys, the fresh writing that had appeared overnight on several headstones. When I developed the pictures later, I'd see things my naked eyes had missed. Figures standing in the background, children playing between the graves, faces in windows of the ruined buildings. But at the time, all I saw was evidence, proof that something impossible was happening on Raven's Ridge. Around noon, I found the diary. It was buried under the stone steps of the church, wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow kept it dry and readable all these years. The cover was leather, soft and worn, with Emily Ashford, my private thoughts, written in careful script on the front. I opened it to the last entry, dated December 21st, 1847. "The fever took Mama today. Papa says I must be strong, that I am the last of our family now, but I am not strong. I am scared and cold, and I want my Mama." The bells have been ringing for 3 days now, one for each person who has died. Soon they will ring for me too. I have been having dreams. In the dreams, the town is not empty. We are all here together, all the people who died. We have church services every evening where Reverend Mills reads from the good book and tells us we are safe now. But I do not feel safe. I feel lost. If anyone finds this book, please know that we existed. We loved each other. We took care of each other. We were more than just names on stones. I hope someone from our family comes back someday. I
hope they remember us. The handwriting got shakier as the entry went on, and the last few words were barely readable. A child's final thoughts before the fever took her. I sat there on those church steps, holding a dead girl's diary, and cried. For Emily, for all the children who'd died too young, for the whole damn town that had been wiped off the map in 3 terrible weeks. That's when the bells started ringing again. This time, I was ready for them. I pulled out my phone and tried to record the sound, but the device kept glitching. The screen would go black, or the app would crash, or the recording would come back as nothing but static. The bells rang 47 times, just like before. But when they stopped, I heard something new. Voices, men, women, and children, singing hymns in harmony. The sound was coming from inside the ruined church, echoing off the broken walls like there was a full congregation in there, praising God on a Sunday morning. I walked through the empty doorway and looked up at the open sky where the roof used to be. There was nobody there, but the singing got louder and clearer, until I could make out individual voices. A man with a deep bass, a woman hitting the high notes, and underneath it all, children's voices blending together like angels. Then I saw them. Translucent figures filling the church pews that weren't there anymore. Families sitting together, dressed in their Sunday best. Men in dark suits and women in long dresses. Children in clean white clothes with their hair neatly combed. They were singing Amazing Grace, their mouths moving in perfect time with the music I was hearing. And at the front of the church, standing behind a pulpit that was nothing but empty air, was a tall man in preacher's robes. His face was kind but tired, like he'd been giving the same sermon for 134 years. He looked right at me and smiled. "Welcome home, child," he said, though his lips didn't move, and I heard his voice inside my head. "We've been waiting for you." The congregation turned as one to stare at me. 47 faces, young and old, all showing the same expression of desperate hope, like they'd been holding their breath for over a century, and finally, someone had come to let them exhale. In the front row, I saw Emily. She was holding hands with a woman who had to be her mother, and they were both crying tears that caught the sunlight like diamonds. "Please," Emily whispered, her voice carrying across impossible distance. "Please help us go home." The vision lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then the church was empty again, filled with nothing but snow and shadows and the sound of my own heartbeat hammering in my ears. But I understood now. They weren't haunting this place because they were evil or angry. They were trapped here because they'd never been properly laid to rest. The outbreak had happened so fast, the dying so overwhelming that there'd been no time for proper funerals, no time for goodbyes. The survivors had fled in terror, leaving the dead to bury themselves, and my ancestor Mary, just 8 years old, had been the last of our family to leave this place. The last one to see them alive. Now I was the first to come back, the first one who could finish what had been started a century and a half ago. That night, Emily came to me in dreams. I was standing in the cemetery, but it wasn't the broken, overgrown place I'd seen in daylight. This was how it had been in 1847, neat and well-tended, with fresh flowers on every grave and wooden crosses marking the newest burials. Emily was waiting for me by her own headstone, but she wasn't alone. The whole town was there, men, women, and children, all of them pale and translucent, all of them watching me with those same desperate, hopeful eyes. "You came back," Emily said, reaching out to take my hand. Her fingers were cold, but solid, real as anything. "Great-great-grandmama Mary promised someone would come back." "What do you need me to do?" I asked. The little girl led me through the crowd of spirits to the center of the cemetery, where a large circle of stones had been arranged around a bare patch of earth. "This is where they put the others," she said, "the ones who died too fast for proper graves. 23 souls laid to rest without prayer or ceremony. A mass grave." The historical records hadn't mentioned it, but it made sense. When people are dying faster than you can dig individual plots, you do what you have to do. "We can't move on," said a woman I recognized as Emily's mother. Not until we've been properly blessed and sent home to God. Will you help us? I woke up knowing exactly what I had to do. The problem was, I didn't know how to do it. I'm not a preacher. I've never performed a funeral service in my life. But I remembered my grandmother's stories about the old ways, the mountain traditions that went back generations. And I had Emily's diary, which included detailed descriptions of how funeral rites were conducted in the settlement. I spent the morning gathering what I needed. Pine boughs for ceremonial wreaths, stones from the creek to mark the mass grave properly. Candles I'd brought for emergencies, now repurposed for memorial service, and words, prayers and readings I copied from the diary, written in Emily's careful handwriting. As the sun started to set, I set up the ceremony site. I arranged the stones in a proper circle, placed candles at cardinal points, and laid out pine wreaths for each of the 23 souls buried in the mass grave. Then I opened Emily's diary to the page where she'd written about her father's funeral and began to read. "We are gathered here to remember the dead," I said, my voice carrying across the empty cemetery. "To honor their memory and help them find their way home." The air shimmered, and suddenly I wasn't alone anymore. They came out of the forest, out of the ruins, out of the very stones themselves. 47 spirits, the entire population of Raven's Ridge, gathering around me in a circle, men and women and children, all dressed in their finest clothes, all looking at me with gratitude and relief. Emily stood at my right hand, her mother at her left. The preacher took his place across from me, his Bible open to a passage about eternal rest. And in the center of it all, the mass grave seemed to glow with soft, golden light. "Speak their names," the preacher said, his voice echoing from very far away. I read from the records I'd brought, calling out each name slowly and clearly. Thomas Whitman, aged 45. Sarah Whitman, aged 42. Jacob Whitman, aged 12. As I spoke each name, a figure stepped forward and bowed their head. Men who'd been fathers and farmers, women who'd been mothers and healers, children who'd barely had a chance to live. When I finished the last name, the spirits began to sing. The same hymn I'd heard in the ruined church, but this time I could feel it as well as hear it. The melody wrapped around me like warm arms, filled with peace and joy and the kind of love that transcends death. The light from the mass grave grew brighter, and I realized it wasn't coming from the ground. It was coming from somewhere else, somewhere beyond this world. A doorway opening, a path home. One by one, the spirits began to fade. But before they left, each one stopped to touch my hand or shoulder, to whisper thank you, in voices like wind through leaves. The preacher was the last to go, placing his hand on my forehead in blessing. "You done good, child," he said. "Your family can be proud." Emily lingered the longest, holding my hand as her form grew more and more transparent. "Will you remember us?" she asked. "Always," I promised. She smiled one last time, and then she was gone, following the light to wherever spirits go when they finally find peace. The bells rang once more as the last ghost disappeared. Not the slow, mournful toll of funeral bells, but the joyful peal of church bells on a Sunday morning. Then silence fell over Raven's Ridge, deeper and more complete than any quiet I'd ever heard. For the first time in 134 years, the dead were truly at rest. I hiked back down the mountain the next morning, but I wasn't the same person who'd climbed up 3 days before. How could I be? I'd looked into the eyes of the dead and helped them find their way home. I'd completed a sacred duty that had been waiting 5 generations for someone from my family to fulfill. The Park Service was skeptical when I filed my report, but they couldn't argue with the evidence. The historical survey was more complete than anyone had expected, with photographs and documentation that would help preserve the memory of Ravens Ridge for future generations. I recommended the site be designated as a historic cemetery and protected under state preservation laws. What I didn't tell them was that the bells had stopped ringing. The reports from hikers stopped too. No more midnight tolling echoing across the mountains. No more mysterious sounds that couldn't be explained. Ravens Ridge had gone quiet at last, but I kept going back. Once a month, I make the 8-mile hike to tend the cemetery and leave flowers on the graves. I've got funding now to restore the headstones and clear the underbrush. The mass grave has its own monument, with all 23 names carved in black granite. And every year, on November 22nd, the anniversary of the outbreak, I hold a memorial service. It's a small gathering, mostly park rangers and local historians, along with a few descendants of families who lived in the area. We read the names, share what we know about their lives, and make sure they're remembered, because that's what they wanted in the end, not revenge or justice or any of the things you see in horror movies, just to be remembered, to have someone acknowledge that they'd existed, that they'd loved each other, that their lives had meant something, that hills are full of places like Ravens Ridge, lost settlements where entire communities disappeared, leaving nothing behind but stone foundations and forgotten graves. I've started researching them, mapping them out, documenting what's left before it's too late. Sometimes, late at night in my office, I get phone calls from people who've heard about my work, hikers who've seen lights where no light should be, families who've found old cemeteries on their property, descendants of mountain people who've felt the pull of ancestral ground calling them home. I listen to their stories, and I help when I can, because I understand now that some debts pass down through blood from generation to generation until someone finally steps up to honor them. The mountains remember everything, every life lived, every death mourned, every promise made. They're patient, the mountains. They can wait 100 years, 200, however long it takes, for the right person to come along and set things right. But they never forget, and neither should we. Last week I got a call about strange sounds coming from a place called Widow's Hollow, where a logging camp disappeared in 1923. The caller was a young woman named Sarah Mitchell, whose great-grandfather had worked there before it closed down. "I think they're trying to tell me something," she said. "I think they're waiting for someone to come home. I'm driving up there tomorrow. Got my camping gear, my historical research, my grandmother's old Bible, everything I need to help the restless find peace. Because that's my job now, not just as a park ranger, but as a daughter of these mountains. When the dead call, I answer. When the forgotten need to be remembered, I'm there. And somewhere in the mist between the peaks, I know Emily is smiling." The bells of Ravens Ridge are silent now, but their message echoes on. Honor your ancestors. Remember the dead. Some promises are too important to break, even if it takes a century to keep them. The mountains are watching. The mountains remember. And when you're ready, they'll call you home too.
My name is Vincent Crawford, but everyone calls me Vinny. I've been a park ranger in the Cumberland Mountains for 17 years now, and before that, I spent 12 years as a detective in Nashville. You might wonder why a cop would trade city streets for mountain trails. The truth is, after seeing what people can do to each other in dark alleys and quiet houses, I thought the wilderness would be cleaner, simpler. I was wrong about that, but not in the way you'd think. It was November 1992 when everything changed. The leaves had fallen, leaving the trees looking like skeleton fingers against the grey sky. Hunting season was in full swing, which meant my radio crackled constantly with reports of lost hunters, illegal camping, and the occasional poaching case. But this call was different. "Ranger Crawford, we got a situation up on Backbone Ridge," dispatch said through the static. "Hunter's been calling in for 3 days straight. Says someone's been following him." Backbone Ridge. Even the name made me uneasy. It's a narrow spine of rock that runs for about 15 miles through the highest part of our territory. No roads up there, just a thin trail that hugs the ridgeline, and if you slip on either side, you're looking at a 1,000-foot drop into nothing but trees and rocks. The ridge has history, the kind that settles into a place like smoke in old wood. During the Civil War, Confederate deserters used to hide up there, picking off Union patrols and robbing anyone foolish enough to travel the old mountain roads alone. Local stories say some of them never left, even after the war ended. Every ranger who's worked these mountains has heard the tales, but I'd always figured they were just stories, old-timers told to spook newcomers. I grabbed my gear and headed out to meet the hunter. His name was Bill Hodges, a local man in his 50s who'd been hunting these mountains since he was old enough to hold a rifle. When I found him at the trailhead, he looked like he hadn't slept in days. His hands shook as he lit his third cigarette in 10 minutes. "Ranger, I know how this sounds," he said, not meeting my eyes. "But someone's been tracking me up there. 3 days now. I hear 'em at night, moving around my camp. See shapes in my peripheral vision during the day, but when I look direct, there's nothing there." I'd heard reports like this before. Isolation does things to people's minds, especially when they're alone in the wilderness for days. You get a look at this person? Height, build, clothing? That's just it. Bill pulled out a small camera, the kind with instant film. I've been taking pictures, trying to catch whoever it is. He handed me 3 photos, all taken around his campsite. I looked at the first picture. It showed Bill standing next to his tent, smiling at the camera. His shadow stretched out behind him, dark and clear on the ground. But in the photo there was another shadow, a human-shaped shadow, standing
right behind Bill, even though no one else was in the picture. My police training kicked in. Could be a double exposure, or maybe... "Look at the other 2, Bill interrupted. The second photo showed Bill cooking over his camp stove. Again, his shadow was there, and again, there was another shadow beside it, this one reaching toward Bill's shadow like it was trying to touch him. The third photo was taken at dusk, showing Bill sitting by his fire. This time, there were 3 extra shadows surrounding his, and they seemed to be moving even in the still photograph. "I got more back at camp," Bill said, "but I ain't going back up there alone. Whatever's on that ridge ain't natural." I should have been skeptical. Shadow people? In 20 years of law enforcement, I'd chased real monsters, the kind that walk on 2 legs and hurt children and destroy families. I'd always believed that imagination was worse than reality, that fear of the unknown was just fear of admitting we don't understand everything. But looking at those photos, I felt something cold settle in my stomach. The shadows were too perfect, too purposeful. They looked like they belonged to real people, but there were no people there to cast them. "I'll check it out," I told Bill. "Stay down here tonight. If there's someone up there playing games, I'll find them." As Bill drove away, I stood at the base of the ridge, looking up at the narrow trail that disappeared into the clouds. The sun was setting behind the mountains, and the first stars were starting to show. Somewhere up there, 15 miles of ridge walking away, something was waiting. I thought about my family, my wife Sarah, and our 2 boys, Marcus and David. David, my oldest at 16, had been begging me to let him go on his first solo camping trip. I'd been thinking about letting him try Backbone Ridge, figuring it was isolated enough to be safe from other people. Now I wasn't so sure what kind of safety I'd been worried about. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and something else, something old and musty, like clothes that had been buried for a long time. I checked my equipment one more time: radio, GPS, first aid kit, service weapon, and enough supplies for 2 days. If someone was up there stalking innocent hunters, they were about to find out what it felt like to be hunted by someone who'd made a career of tracking predators. I started up the trail as the last light faded from the sky, not knowing I was walking into something that would change everything I thought I knew about what was real and what was just story. The trail up Backbone Ridge starts easy enough, winding through thick pine forest where the trees block most of the wind. But after the first mile, it gets serious in a hurry. The path narrows to barely 3 feet wide, with drop-offs on both sides that disappear into darkness. During the day, you can see for miles in every direction from up there. At night, you're walking a tightrope between 2 black holes. I'd hiked this trail dozens of times in daylight, but never at night. My flashlight beams seemed small and weak against the massive darkness surrounding me. Every few minutes, I'd stop and listen, the way I used to listen for footsteps in dark alleys when I was working cases in Nashville. But all I heard was wind and the distant call of an owl. After 3 hours of climbing, I reached Bill's campsite. He'd set up in a small clearing about 50 yards off the main trail, tucked between 2 large boulders that provided some shelter from the wind. The remains of his fire were still warm, and his gear was scattered around like he'd left in a hurry. I made camp nearby, but didn't light a fire. If someone was watching, I wanted the advantage of darkness. I set up my small tent, arranged my sleeping bag, and settled in to wait. The plan was simple. If Bill's stalker came back looking for him, they'd find me instead. Around midnight, the temperature dropped, and fog started rolling in from the valleys below. That's when I heard the first footsteps. They were careful, measured, like someone trying not to make noise but not quite succeeding. I grabbed my radio and service weapon, then crept to the edge of my camp. The footsteps seemed to be circling the clearing, staying just outside the range of my night vision. "This is Ranger Crawford," I called out. "Identify yourself." The footsteps stopped. For several minutes, there was only silence and wind. Then I heard something that made my skin crawl. Whispered voices, too quiet to understand, but definitely human. Or at least they sounded human. I switched on my flashlight and swept it around the clearing. Nothing, just trees and rocks and swirling fog. But when I looked down at the ground near my feet, I saw something that didn't make sense. Footprints, fresh ones, leading right up to where I was standing, then stopping. But there were no footprints leading away. It was like whoever made them had just vanished into thin air. I followed the tracks backward, my flashlight beam dancing over the rocky ground. The prints were clear in the soft dirt between the rocks, work boots size 10 or 11, with a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel. But after about 20 feet, they just ended. No scuff marks, no sign of jumping or running, just gone. My police instincts told me someone was playing psychological games, trying to spook me the way they'd spooked Bill. I'd seen criminals use fear as a weapon before. But the rational part of my mind was having trouble explaining what I was seeing. I went back to my camp and got my camera, the same kind Bill had been using. If someone was out there, I was going to get proof. I took several photos of the footprint trail, making sure to include the point where they disappeared. When the film developed, I stared at the pictures for a long time. The footprints were there, clear as day. But in the photo there was something else. A shadow fell across the prints, a human-shaped shadow that didn't belong to me or anything else in the picture. That's when I noticed my radio was crackling with static. But it wasn't random static, it had a pattern, almost like whispered words. I turned up the volume and listened closely. "Get off our ridge, leave now, this is our place." The voices were faint, but clear, speaking in an accent I'd never heard before. Old-fashioned, like something from a Civil War movie. But my radio was supposed to be on a secure channel, and there were no other rangers in the area. I keyed the mic. "This is Ranger Crawford. Who is this? Identify yourself immediately." The static stopped. Then after a moment came a voice clearer than the others. "We know who you are, lawman. You got no authority here. This ridge belongs to us, same as it always has." My blood went cold. I'd never told anyone over the radio that I used to be a police officer. That information wasn't in any public records connected to my ranger position. Whoever was talking had done research on me. "If you're trying to intimidate me, it's not working," I said into the radio. "Come out and talk face to face." Laughter. Low, mean laughter that seemed to come from all around me instead of just the radio speaker. "You want to see us? Look behind you." I spun around, flashlight ready, nothing but empty forest. But when I looked down, I saw my own shadow stretching out in front of me, and standing right next to it was another shadow, tall and thin, wearing what looked like an old military cap. I pointed my flashlight directly at the spot where the shadow should be coming from. Empty air. But the shadow was still there on the ground, as clear as my own. "What the hell?" I whispered. The shadow moved, turning to face my shadow like it was looking at me. Then it raised what looked like a rifle, pointing it at my shadow's head. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. When I looked down again, the strange shadow was gone. But I could still hear that laughter coming from the darkness beyond my flashlight beam. I'd been a cop for 12 years. I'd seen drug dealers who'd do anything to protect their territory, gang members who used fear and intimidation as tools of control. This felt like that, but wrong somehow. Too coordinated, too personal. I checked my watch. 1:30 a.m. I had hours until dawn, and something told me the night was just getting started. As if responding to my thoughts, I heard new sounds from the forest around me. Footsteps again, but this time from multiple directions. And voices, those same old-fashioned accents, but more of them now. They were talking to each other in low tones, like a group of hunters discussing strategy. I couldn't make out individual words, but the tone was clear enough. They were planning something, and I was the target. I packed my gear quickly and started moving toward higher ground. If someone wanted to play games in the dark, I'd give them a moving target. But as I climbed higher up the ridge, the voices followed me. And worse, I started seeing more shadows, human-shaped darkness moving between the trees, always just at the edge of my vision. By 3 a.m. I was beginning to understand why Bill had looked so scared. Whatever was happening on Backbone Ridge wasn't just someone playing pranks. This was organized, intelligent, and getting more aggressive by the hour. And I still had 12 hours until dawn. By sunrise, I'd counted at least 6 different voices and seen more shadows than I wanted to think about. But as the first light crept over the mountains, everything went quiet. The voices stopped, the shadows disappeared, and I was left alone on the ridge with nothing but wind and my own exhaustion. I tried to radio dispatch, but my calls wouldn't go through. The radio worked. I could hear static and occasional chatter from other rangers in distant sectors, but whenever I tried to transmit, nothing happened. It was like something was blocking my signal. I spent the morning examining the area more carefully, using techniques I'd learned as a detective. What I found made me question everything I thought I knew about what was possible. The footprints I'd seen the night before were still there, but they told a strange story. The tracks seemed to appear from nowhere and disappeared just as suddenly, but they followed logical patrol patterns. Someone or something was systematically checking every possible hiding spot, every escape route, every defensive position. It was military thinking, the kind of tactical awareness you'd expect from trained soldiers. But these weren't modern boot prints. The wear patterns, the size, even the depth suggested old-fashioned work boots, the kind people wore a century ago. Around noon, I found their camp. It was tucked into a natural cave about a quarter-mile off the main trail, hidden behind a curtain of dead vines and fallen rocks. If I hadn't been looking for signs of long-term occupation, I would have walked right past it. Inside, the cave stretched back about 30 feet into the mountain. Someone had been living there, but the remains weren't recent. I found rusted metal plates, the kind used by Civil War soldiers, fragments of grey cloth that might once have been uniforms, and carved into the cave wall, barely visible in the dim light, were words: CSA 43rd Tennessee Deserters Company, Backbone Ridge, our territory, 1865. Below that, in fresher carving that looked maybe 50 years old, still here, still watching, still fighting. My hands were shaking as I photographed the cave. I'd found Civil War artifacts before. The mountains were full of them. But this felt different. This felt active. I was about to leave when I heard voices outside the cave. The same old-fashioned accents from the night. Before, but now, I could make out words. Lawman's found our place. Should have left when we warned him. Time to show him what happens to trespassers. I drew my service weapon and moved toward the cave entrance. Through the vines, I could see movement in the forest beyond. Human shapes flitting between trees, but never clear enough to get a good look. "I'm a federal officer," I called out. "Show yourselves and we can talk." Laughter again, that same cold sound I'd heard on the radio. Federal? Boy, we've been fighting Federals since before your granddaddy was born. One of the shapes stepped closer to the cave entrance, and for just a moment I got a clear look. It was a man in a tattered grey uniform, carrying an old rifle. But he was transparent, like looking through grey smoke. I could see the trees behind him through his body. "This ain't possible," I whispered. "Lots of things ain't possible," the figure said, and his voice came from right beside my ear, even though he was 20 feet away. "Don't make 'em any less real." I stumbled out of the cave, my gun pointed at nothing and everything. The forest around me was full of movement now, dozens of transparent figures in Confederate uniforms, all carrying weapons that looked like they belonged in a museum. "What do you want?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Same thing we always wanted," said the figure who seemed to be their leader. "To hold our ground. This ridge is ours, Lawman, has been since 1865 and will be long after your dust." "You're dead," I said. "You died over 100 years ago." "Death ain't the end of everything," he replied, "especially when you got unfinished business. We deserted from a war that wasn't ours to fight, came up here to live free. When they sent soldiers after us, we fought. When we died, we kept fighting." More figures were becoming visible, a full company of ghost soldiers spread throughout the forest around me. Some were missing arms or legs, others had bullet holes in their chests, or skulls split open by sabers. All of them looked angry. "You want to live free, that's your business," I said. "But you're scaring innocent people. That hunter you've been stalking, he didn't do anything to you." "Every person who comes up here brings the outside world with them," the leader said. "Brings change, brings authority. We won't have it." That's when I thought about David, my 16-year-old son. He'd been planning his solo camping trip for months, and I'd told him Backbone Ridge would be perfect, safe and isolated, I'd said, away from the dangers of civilization. "There's a boy coming up here next week," I said. "My son, he's just a kid looking for adventure." The leader smiled, showing teeth that were grey as old bone. "Then you better tell him to find adventure somewhere else. We don't care how old they are. This is our territory. I won't let you hurt him." "You won't be
able to stop us," he said. "You're just one man, and we are legion. We know every rock, every tree, Every hiding place on this ridge. We've had over a century to learn. The other figures were moving closer now, forming a circle around me. I could smell them, the musty odour of old graves and wet earth. My flashlight began to dim, even though I'd put fresh batteries in that morning. "What are you?" I asked. "We're what's left when men refuse to quit fighting," the leader said. "We're what happens when the war never ends." The circle was tightening. My radio crackled to life on its own, and I heard my own voice coming through the speaker, but distorted. "Mayday, mayday! Officer down on Backbone Ridge! Send immediate backup!" But I hadn't keyed the mic. I hadn't said anything. "How are you doing that?" "We've been watching you lawmen for decades," he said. "Learning your ways, your tools. Radio signals ain't much different from voices on the wind if you know how to work with them." My GPS unit started beeping frantically, showing my location as moving rapidly even though I was standing still. Then my compass began spinning wildly, the needle never settling on any direction. "You're jamming my equipment. We're making sure you can't call for help," he corrected. "This is between you and us, no outside interference." I realized then that I was in more trouble than I'd ever been in, even during my worst days as a police detective. These weren't criminals I could arrest or threats I could shoot. These were something else entirely, and they had advantages I couldn't match. But I was still a father, and my son was depending on me to keep him safe. "What will it take?" I asked. "To keep the boy safe?" The leader considered this, his transparent head tilted like he was listening to voices I couldn't hear. The other figures seemed to be waiting for his decision. "Prove you understand," he said finally. "Prove you respect what we are and what we're protecting. Spend the night here, alone, with no weapons and no radio. If you survive until dawn without running, we'll consider letting the boy pass safely. And if I don't survive," his smile widened, "then it won't matter what happens to your boy, will it?" The circle of Confederate ghosts began to fade as the sun started setting again. But their leader remained solid, his grey eyes fixed on mine. "You got until full dark to decide, lawman. Run now and we'll know you're a coward. Stay and we'll test whether you're worthy of respect." As he faded away, I heard him add one more thing. "Oh, and Ranger, tonight we won't just be watching, tonight we'll be hunting." I looked at my watch. 6:30 p.m. Sunset in 30 minutes. And somewhere down in the valley, my son David was probably packing his gear for the camping trip he'd been planning for months. I had a choice to make, and not much time to make it. I made my choice. I emptied my service
Weapon, putting all 6 bullets into a tree trunk, then dropped the gun 20 feet from where I planned to wait. My radio went the same distance in the opposite direction. If the Confederate ghosts wanted to test my courage, I'd give them what they asked for. But I wasn't going in blind. 20 years of law enforcement had taught me that every predator, living or dead, had weaknesses. I just had to figure out what theirs were. As darkness fell, I sat cross-legged on a flat rock near the cave entrance and waited. The first thing I noticed was how quiet everything became. No wind, no night sounds, even my own breathing seemed muted. It was like the whole mountain was holding its breath. The leader materialized first, stepping out of a tree like he was walking through a doorway. "Still here, I see." "I keep my word," I said. "We'll see." He gestured, and the rest of his company began appearing throughout the forest. More than I'd seen before, maybe 30 or 40 figures in tattered Confederate uniforms, all carrying weapons from another century. "Tell me about 1865, I said, "and tell me how you really died." His expression darkened. "What's that matter to you?" "Because I think you're still fighting a war that ended over 100 years ago. And I think that's why you can't leave this ridge." "We didn't desert to run away," he said. his voice rising. We deserted because rich men were getting poor men killed for their cotton profits. We came up here to build something better. But the war followed you. They sent a whole company after us, called us traitors and criminals. We fought them right here on this ridge, and we died right here defending our home. More pieces clicked into place. You weren't deserters running away. You were conscientious objectors making a stand. We were soldiers who refused to die for a cause we didn't believe in, he said, and when they came to drag us back to die for their war, we chose to die for our own principles instead. Then why are you still here? Why haven't you moved on? His grey eyes blazed with old anger. Because they never stopped coming. First it was soldiers, then it was tax collectors, then it was government men with badges and papers saying this land belonged to someone else. Every generation brings new invaders trying to take what we died protecting. I stood up slowly, keeping my hands visible. I'm not here to take anything from you, and neither is my son. We're just people trying to find some peace in the mountains. Peace. He spat, the sound echoing strangely in the still air. There's no peace for men like us. There's only the eternal fight to hold what's ours. That's when I understood. These weren't evil spirits or mindless monsters. They were soldiers stuck in an endless war, unable to see that the conflict they died fighting had become irrelevant. They were protecting their territory from threats that no longer existed. The war's over, I said gently. The Confederacy lost. The Union won. It's been over for more than a century. Wars don't end just because politicians say they do, he replied. Not for the men who died fighting them. Then let me ask you this. What exactly are you protecting now? What's on this ridge that's worth an eternity of fighting? He paused, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered across his translucent features. This is our home, our territory. But what's here, besides rocks and trees and wind? The other figures were drawing closer, their weapons raised. I could see confusion on their faces too, like they were hearing questions they'd never considered. We fought and died to be free, the leader said, but his voice lacked conviction. And now you're prisoners, I said, trapped on this ridge, fighting the same battle over and over, never able to rest, never able to move on. How is that freedom? We're protecting... You're protecting nothing, I interrupted. You're just repeating the same patterns because you've forgotten why you started fighting in the first place. The leader's form began to flicker like a radio signal losing strength. Around him, his company was wavering too, their weapons lowering slightly. I was a police officer for 12 years, I continued. I've seen what happens when good men get stuck in cycles of violence. Sometimes the only way to honor what you died for is to let go of the fight and find a different kind of peace. You don't understand, he said, but his voice was weaker now. If we stop fighting, we disappear. If we let go, there's nothing left. Maybe disappearing isn't death. Maybe it's finally getting to go home. That's when I heard it, my radio crackling to life from 20 feet away. But it wasn't the Confederate ghosts this time. It was dispatch. Ranger Crawford, this is base. We've got an emergency. Your boy David didn't wait for permission. He's headed up Backbone Ridge tonight. ETA to your position approximately 2 hours. My blood turned to ice. David was coming up the ridge in the dark, straight into this confrontation, and these ghost soldiers, confused and angry as they were, would see him as just another invader to drive off. Let me go to him, I said to the leader. Let me get my son to safety and then I'll come back. We can finish this discussion. But the Confederate officer's uncertainty was hardening back into resolve. No one leaves the ridge until this is settled. The boy will face the same test you did, prove himself worthy or face the consequences. He's 16 years old, just a boy looking for adventure. I was 17 when I enlisted, the leader said. Age don't matter when it comes to defending what's yours. The other ghosts were raising their weapons again, but now they were pointed at me. I could see the leader making a decision, his translucent hand moving to the pistol at his belt.
You failed the test, lawman. You brought outside interference. You called for help. I didn't call anyone. That was my dispatch checking on me. Don't matter. The boy's coming, and now you got to choose. Watch us deal with him the way we deal with all trespassers or die trying to stop us. That's when I knew the talking was over. These spirits were stuck in a loop of violence and couldn't break free on their own. If David was going to survive the night, I'd have to find another way to stop them. I looked at the Confederate leader, this man who died fighting for the right to live free, who'd spent over a century trapped in an endless war of his own making, and I realized something that might save us all. You want to know what real courage looks like? I said. It's not fighting the same battle forever. It's knowing when to put down your weapons and trust someone else to carry on. What are you saying? I'm saying I'll make you a deal. Let my son pass safely, and I'll stay here permanently. I'll be your representative, your voice to the outside world. When people come up here, I'll make sure they understand what this ridge means and treat it with respect. But the fighting stops here, tonight. The leader stared at me for a long moment. Around him, his company waited for orders. You'd give up your life for the boy? I'd give up my life to end this war, I said. For all of us. He considered this, and slowly his hand moved away from his weapon. And if we agree to this bargain, what guarantee do we have that you'll keep your word? The same guarantee you had when you first came up here in 1865, I said. The word of a man who's willing to die for what he believes in. For the first time in our conversation, the Confederate leader smiled, and it wasn't cold or threatening. It was sad and tired, and maybe a little relieved. Ranger Vincent Crawford, he said formally, I accept your terms. As he spoke, I saw lights moving up the trail below, David's flashlight getting closer. But I also saw something else. The ghostly Confederate soldiers were beginning to fade, not with anger or violence, but with something that looked almost like peace. The war was finally over. David found me just after midnight, sitting by the cave entrance with no visible sign of the Confederate company around me. To him, I probably looked like a father who'd hiked up to check on a camping spot and decided to wait for his son to arrive. Dad, what are you doing up here? Making sure it was safe, I told him, which was true enough. How'd you find me so easily? Weird thing, David said, setting down his pack. I kept getting lost on the trail, but then I'd hear voices calling out directions. Old-fashioned voices like from a Civil War movie. Thought maybe you had some kind of historical recording playing or something. I smiled. The Confederate ghosts had kept their word, guiding my son safely up
the ridge instead of threatening him. Something like that. We spent the rest of the night talking, father and son under the stars, surrounded by history that was finally at rest. I told David some of the stories about the ridge, the real ones, not the versions sanitized for park brochures, about men who'd died fighting for the right to live free, and how sometimes freedom meant knowing when to stop fighting. When dawn came, we hiked back down together, but I knew I'd be returning to Backbone Ridge soon, and often. Not as a ranger investigating supernatural threats, but as something else, a liaison between the living and the dead, making sure both sides understood and respected each other. Over the following months, I developed new protocols for Backbone Ridge, warning signs that mentioned the historical significance of the area and the need for respectful behavior, required check-ins for anyone planning to camp overnight, and a strict policy that no one went up there alone unless they were experienced enough to handle whatever they might encounter. The ghost sightings didn't stop entirely, but they changed. Instead of threatening shadows and hostile voices, visitors reported helpful guidance when they got lost, warnings about dangerous weather, and an odd sense of being watched over rather than stalked. Bill Hodges, the hunter who'd first reported the shadow stalking, came back to the ridge the following spring. He said he didn't see any strange shadows in his photos this time, but he did hear voices on the wind, old voices saying, "Welcome back," and "Good hunting." As for David, his solo camping trip became the first of many. He'd inherited his father's comfort with the mountains and something else, an ability to sense when the past was speaking to the present. More than once, he came back from Backbone Ridge with stories about finding the perfect campsite, right where someone had suggested, or hearing warnings about bad weather just in time to take shelter. I never told him the full truth about what happened that night. Some stories are too heavy for children to carry, even when the children grow up to be rangers themselves. But David knew the ridge was special and he treated it with the respect it deserved. The Confederate Company of Backbone Ridge became my partners in protecting the wilderness they'd died for. They'd learned that not every visitor was an invader, and I'd learned that not every ghost was a threat. Some were just soldiers still trying to serve long after their war had ended. On quiet nights, when I'm doing my final rounds in the mountains, I sometimes hear voices on the wind, old voices with familiar accents calling out, "All quiet on the ridge, Ranger," or "Nothing to report from the high ground," or "Das tui." And I key my radio and respond, "Copy that. Thanks for keeping watch." It's been 3 years now since that November night when everything changed. The Cumberland Mountains are still wild and dangerous, still full of unexpected encounters and impossible choices, but they're also protected by guardians who understand that some territories are worth defending forever and some battles are worth fighting even after death. Backbone Ridge belongs to the past, but it's guarded by the present. And as long as people like David are willing to listen to voices on the wind and respect the stories written in stone and shadow, the mountain will keep its secrets and protect its own. The war is over, but the watch continues. Ranger Vincent Crawford still patrols the Cumberland Mountains. His son David graduated from ranger training in 1995 and now works the same territory. Both men understand that some places require more than law enforcement. They require respect for the dead who still call those places home. My name is Samuel Hartwell, but everyone calls me Sam. I've been a park ranger in these Blue Ridge Mountains for 19 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these woods could throw at me. Bears, mountain lions, lost hikers, drunk campers, you name it, I've dealt with it. But what happened up on Widow's Peak in March of 1987 changed everything I thought I knew about these mountains. I'm 44 years old, married to the most patient woman in Virginia, and we've got 3 boys who think their dad is some kind of superhero because I wear a badge and carry a radio. My wife, Sarah, was pregnant with our 4th child that spring, which made what happened even harder to bear. I used to be military police before I took this job, so tracking comes naturally to me. I can follow a deer trail in the dark and tell you what the animal ate for breakfast. That's why they called me when 3 rock climbers went missing on the peak. Widow's Peak sits about 12 miles from the nearest road, rising full 200 feet above sea level, like a stone finger pointing at the sky. The Cherokee used to call it where the grieving women walked, though most folks don't know that anymore. It's all granite and rhododendron thickets, with cliff faces that drop straight down for hundreds of feet. Cell phones don't work up there because the ridgeline blocks all the towers. When you're on that peak, you're truly alone. The missing climbers were experienced guys from Richmond, Tom Bradley, Mike Chen, and David Ross. They'd been climbing together for years and knew what they were doing. They'd registered for a technical ascent of the North Face, which is about as difficult as it gets in Virginia. When they didn't check out on Sunday like they were supposed to, their families started making calls. I remember that morning clearly. It was the first week of March, and we'd had a late snow that left everything white and quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. I was drinking coffee in the ranger station when my supervisor Jim walked in with that look on his face that meant someone was probably dead. "Sam, we got 3 climbers overdue on Widow's Peak," he said, setting down a file folder. "Families called it in. They were supposed to be back yesterday." I looked at the names and recognized the type immediately. City guys with good gear and enough experience to be dangerous. "North Face?" I asked. "Yep, technical route. Could be they're just taking their time, but with this weather." He didn't need to finish. We both knew that late snow could turn rock climbing into a death trap real quick. I gathered my gear, ropes, first aid kit, emergency shelter, the works, and headed out in the park service truck. The drive to the trailhead takes about 40 minutes on winding mountain roads, and with each mile, the feeling in my gut got worse. Not because I thought the climbers were in trouble, necessarily, but because something felt wrong about the whole mountain that morning. The wildlife was acting strange. Usually you see deer, squirrels, plenty of birds. But that day it was like someone had turned off all the sound. No birdsong, no rustling in the bushes. Even the wind seemed muffled. In 19 years of working these mountains, I'd never experienced anything like it. I parked at the trailhead and strapped on my pack. The hike to the base of the climbing routes takes about 2 hours through dense forest, and normally I enjoy it. But that day, every step felt wrong. The snow was too white, the shadows too dark. I kept thinking I heard voices calling from up ahead, but when I stopped to listen, there was nothing. About halfway to the peak, I found the first sign of the climbers. A candy bar wrapper caught in some bushes, the kind of thing experienced climbers usually don't leave behind. Then I found a water bottle, and farther up, a carabiner lying in the snow. Individual pieces of gear scattered along the trail like breadcrumbs. That's when I should have turned around and called for backup. But you have to understand. At that point, I was still thinking like a rational person. Maybe they'd had some gear failures. Maybe they were moving fast and dropping things. It happens, even to experienced climbers. But when I reached the base of the North Face and saw what was waiting for me there, rational thinking went right out the window. The climbing rope was hanging about 50 feet up the rock face, swaying gently in the breeze. That was normal enough. Climbers often leave ropes in place for multiple pitches. But when I got my binoculars out and took a closer look, my blood ran cold. The rope had been cut. Not frayed from wear, not damaged by rockfall, but cut clean through with something sharp. The ends hung there like severed arteries, and below them on the ledge was a coil of expensive climbing rope that must have cost $300. No climber in his right mind abandons gear like that. I called out, cupping my hands around my mouth. "Tom! Mike! David!" My voice echoed off the cliff faces and came back to me, twisted and strange, like it was being passed through water. No answer. I started climbing the approach route they would have taken, following the standard path up to the first belay station. I'm not a technical climber like those missing guys, but I know enough to get around on rock when I need to. About 100 feet up, I found more gear scattered on the ledges. A helmet here, some pitons there, all of it clean and undamaged, but abandoned. Then I found the first track. It was pressed into a patch of snow on a narrow ledge, clear as day. At first glance, it looked human, about the size of a woman's foot, maybe size 10. But when I knelt down to examine it closer, I saw things that made my skin crawl. The foot was too long, stretched out like someone had grabbed the heel and toe and pulled, and there were marks in the snow beside the toes. That looked like claw scratches, I photographed it with my camera, then kept climbing. The tracks led up the cliff face on a route that would be impossible for any normal person to follow. They went straight up vertical sections where you'd need ropes and specialized gear, but there was no evidence of any climbing equipment being used. At the second belay station, I found something that made me sit down hard on the rock. Tom Bradley's driver's license, placed neatly on the stone, like someone had set it there on purpose. It wasn't damaged, wasn't even dirty, just sitting there waiting for someone to find it. I keyed my radio but got nothing but static. The ridgeline was blocking transmission just like always. I was completely cut off from the outside world, alone on a cliff face with evidence that something very bad had happened to 3 experienced climbers. That's when I heard the crying. It started soft, like wind through the trees, but gradually became more distinct. A woman's voice, sobbing with the kind of grief that comes from deep loss. The sound was coming from somewhere above me, echoing down the cliff face. I looked up, but saw nothing except empty rock and sky. "Hello," I called out. "Are you injured? Do you need help?" The crying stopped instantly, like someone had flipped a switch. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been. I waited for maybe 5 minutes, but nothing more came. I kept climbing, following the scattered gear and those impossible tracks. At about 300 feet up, I reached a ledge that should have been unreachable without technical equipment. But there, arranged in a neat pile, were the rest of the climbers' belongings. 3 backpacks, 3 sleeping bags, even their car keys. Everything laid out like someone was organizing a yard sale, but no sign of the climbers themselves. I examined the gear carefully, looking for bloodstains or signs of struggle. Everything was clean, untorn, perfect, like the men had simply vanished and left their possessions behind. In my military days, I'd seen what happens when people fall from heights or get mauled by animals. This wasn't that. This was something else entirely. The tracks continued up from the ledge, still following that impossible vertical route. I got out my binoculars and traced them as far as I could see. They led to another ledge about 200 feet higher up, a narrow shelf of rock that no human being could possibly reach without helicopters or some serious technical rescue equipment. And on that ledge I could just make out 3 dark shapes lying motionless in the snow. I tried the radio again, got static that almost sounded like whispering. The wind was picking up and clouds were moving in fast. I had maybe 2 hours of daylight left and no way to reach those bodies without help. That's when I saw movement on the cliff face above me. At first I thought it was a bird or maybe a piece of loose rock, caught by the wind, but when I focused my binoculars on it, I saw something that made me forget how to breathe. A figure was moving up the sheer rock face about 400 feet above me, moving fast, like it was walking on level ground instead of climbing a vertical cliff. It was tall and thin, dressed in something white that fluttered in the wind. And it was moving without any ropes, without any equipment at all, moving like gravity didn't apply to it. I watched through the binoculars as the figure reached the ledge where the bodies lay. It knelt beside them, and even from that distance, I could see it stroking their heads like a mother comforting sleeping children. Then it looked down at me. Even through 400 feet of distance and magnification, I felt those eyes on me like ice water in my veins. The figure stood slowly and raised one impossibly long arm, pointing directly at me. The crying started again, but now it was coming from all around me, echoing off every rock surface until it felt like the whole mountain was weeping. I started climbing down as fast as I could safely move. I made it off the cliff face just as the sun was setting, and I've never been so grateful to feel solid ground under my feet. But the crying followed me all the way down, and by the time I reached the trailhead, I could swear I heard it calling my name. "Sam! Sam! Help me find them!" I drove straight to the ranger station and found Jim waiting for me with a search and rescue team from the state police. 6 men with technical climbing gear and helicopters on standby. Professional help, which is exactly what I thought we needed. "What's the situation up there?" Jim asked as I walked in. I opened my mouth to tell them about the cut ropes and the impossible tracks and the figure on the cliff face, but the words wouldn't come. These were rational men who dealt with facts and evidence. How do you tell someone that 3 climbers were killed by something that could walk up vertical rock faces? "Found their gear scattered on the ledges," I said finally. "Looks like they fell. Bodies are on a ledge about 500 feet up the north face. Gonna need technical rescue to recover them." The team leader, a guy named Peterson from Richmond, nodded grimly. "Weather's supposed to be good tomorrow. We'll go up at first light with the helicopter." That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure pointing down at me from the cliff face. I kept thinking about the Cherokee name for the peak, where the grieving women walked. I'd always assumed it was just another local legend, but now I wondered if there was more truth to it than anyone realized. The next morning, I led the rescue team back up to Widow's Peak. It was a perfect spring day, clear skies and no wind, the kind of day that makes you think everything is right with the world. But as we got closer to the mountain, that feeling of wrongness came back stronger than ever. The helicopter pilot, a veteran named Rodriguez, sat down at the base of the cliff face and immediately started having problems with his instruments. "Radio's full of static," he reported over the headset. "GPS is jumping around like a pinball, and these wind readings don't make sense." "What do you mean?" Peterson asked. "According to my instruments, there are downdrafts coming off the cliff face that shouldn't exist. The wind patterns are all wrong for this terrain." But we pressed on with the mission. Rodriguez lifted off with Peterson and another climber named Morrison to attempt a recovery from the ledge where I'd seen the bodies. I stayed on the ground with the rest of the team, coordinating by radio. For the first hour, everything went according to plan. The helicopter positioned itself near the high ledge, and Peterson rappelled down to investigate. His voice crackled over the radio, professional and calm. "I've got 3 bodies on the ledge," he reported. "Adult males, no obvious trauma. Looks like they've been here for a couple days, beginning recovery operations." Then his voice changed. "Wait, something's wrong here. These guys, they're arranged too neatly, like someone posed them. And there's wedding rings embedded in the rock cracks. Old ones like from the 1800s. The radio crackled with static, and we lost contact for several minutes. When Peterson's voice came back, it was tight with fear. "We need to get off this mountain right now. There's something up here, something that—" The transmission cut off completely. Rodriguez's voice came through a moment later, high and panicked. "The downdrafts just got worse. Wind shear coming from nowhere. I can't maintain position." I watched through binoculars as the helicopter was buffeted by invisible forces, swinging wildly despite the clear, calm day. Rodriguez fought the controls, but whatever was affecting his aircraft wasn't showing any mercy. Then I saw her. The figure from yesterday was back on the cliff face, but now she was much closer. Close enough to see her clearly without magnification. She was at least 9 feet tall, impossibly thin, dressed in what looked like a tattered white wedding dress. Her hair hung long and black down her back, and her arms were stretched out way too far, like someone had pulled her on a rack. And she was moving toward the helicopter. "Rodriguez, get out of there!" I shouted into my radio. "Get Peterson and get out!" But it was too late. The figure reached out with those impossibly long arms and touched the side of the aircraft. The helicopter spun out of control instantly, auto-rotating down toward the trees with Rodriguez fighting to maintain some kind of controlled crash. They went down hard in a clearing about half a mile from the base of the cliff. When we reached the crash site, Rodriguez was unconscious but alive, blood running from his ears. Peterson and Morrison were nowhere to be found. Rodriguez came to as we were loading him into our emergency transport vehicle. His first words were about what he'd seen on the cliff face. "There was a woman," he whispered, gripping my arm. "A woman in white. She was crying and calling for someone named William. She kept saying, 'Have you seen my William? Help me find my William.'" We got Rodriguez to the hospital and organized another search team, but I knew we weren't going to find Peterson and Morrison alive. Whatever was on that mountain had claimed 5 men now, and it wasn't done hunting. That night, I drove home to Sarah and tried to act normal, but she could see something was wrong. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, setting down a plate of dinner I couldn't even think about eating. "Maybe I have," I admitted. She sat down beside me and took my hand. "Sam, whatever's happening up there, you need to be careful. This baby needs his father to come home safe." I looked at her round belly and felt something break inside my chest. She was right, of course. I had responsibilities, a family that depended on me, but I also knew that whatever was on Widow's Peak wasn't going to stop with 5 victims. It was still hunting, still calling out for its lost William. And for some reason I couldn't explain, I felt like I was the only one who could stop it. I went back to the mountain alone the next morning. Against every regulation in the book and every instinct for self-preservation I'd developed over 19 years of ranger work. But I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think about anything except that figure in white calling for William. I'd spent half the night in the county library, digging through old records and Cherokee tribal histories. What I found changed everything I thought I knew about Widow's Peak. During the Civil War, dozens of women from the surrounding valleys had husbands who went off to fight and never came home. When the war ended and the men didn't return, some of these wives couldn't accept that their husbands were dead. They would climb up to Widow's Peak because it was the highest point around, thinking they could see farther, maybe spot their men coming home down the mountain roads. According to the tribal records, 7 women died up there during the winter of 1867, frozen to death while waiting for husbands who were already buried in unmarked graves hundreds of miles away. The Cherokee found their bodies in the spring, still clutching photographs and wedding rings, still facing toward the roads where they thought their men would appear. The tribal elder I spoke with told me something that made my blood run cold. Grief that strong doesn't just disappear when the body dies, Ranger Hartwell. Sometimes it walks around, still looking for what it lost. So I went back up that mountain with a different understanding of what I was dealing with. This wasn't just some monster or local legend. This was concentrated human grief, powerful enough to reach across more than a century and still be hunting for resolution. I reached the base of the cliff face just as the morning mist was lifting. The silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, no wind. Just the sound of my own breathing and heartbeat echoing off the rocks. I called out to her, "I know you're there. I know what you're looking for." The response was immediate. That crying started again, but now it was coming from directly above me. I looked up and saw her descending the cliff face like she was walking down a staircase. 9 feet tall, white dress flowing around her like water, arms so long they nearly touched the ground. When she reached the bottom of the cliff, she stood about 20 feet away from me, and I got my first clear look at her face. She had been beautiful once. You could see it in the bone structure, in the way she held herself. But grief had worn her away like water-carving stone. Her eyes were black holes that seemed to go on forever, and her mouth was open in a constant, silent scream. "Where is my William?" she asked, and her voice was like wind through broken glass. "Have you seen my William? He said he would come home." "William's not coming home," I said, as gently as I could. "The war ended a long time ago. William is dead." She tilted her head at an impossible angle, like a bird studying something it didn't understand. "No," she said. "No, he promised. He said he would find me. I've been waiting. I've been watching the roads." That's when I understood what had happened to the climbers. She had seen them moving on the cliff face and thought one of them might be William. When she realized they weren't, she had taken them anyway, trying to fill the hole in her heart with substitute husbands. "I know you've been waiting," I said, taking a slow step toward her. "I know how much it hurts. But William isn't coming back, and taking other people won't bring him home." Her face twisted with rage and sorrow, and suddenly I felt like I was drowning in grief that wasn't my own. Every loss I'd ever experienced crashed over me at once. My father's death, friends from the military, every person I'd failed to save in 19 years of ranger work. But stronger than all of that was a crushing loneliness that made me want to climb up that cliff and lie down beside those frozen bodies just to make the pain stop. "You don't understand," she wailed, and the sound made rocks shake loose from the cliff face. "You can't understand. He was everything. He was my whole world." "I do understand," I gasped, fighting against the wave of emotion she was projecting. "I have a wife. I have children. If I lost them..." But even as I said it, I could feel her grief trying to convince me that I already had lost them, that they were gone and I was alone forever. I saw Sarah bleeding out in childbirth, saw my boys growing up without a father, saw myself old and forgotten and... I shook my head violently, forcing myself to remember the truth. Sarah was alive. The boys were alive. I had something to fight for. I pulled out my wallet with shaking hands and showed her the photograph of my family. "This is what I have to lose," I said. "This is what William would want for you. He wouldn't want you stuck on this mountain hunting innocent people. He would want you to let go. He would want you to find peace." She stared at the photograph for a long moment, and I saw something flicker across her ruined face. Recognition, maybe, or memory. "I loved him so much," she whispered. "How do I stop loving him?" "You don't," I said. "Love doesn't die, but love doesn't hurt people either. What you're doing now isn't love, it's just pain wearing love's face." She looked up at the cliff face where the bodies of her victims lay frozen on the ledge. I thought, if I could just find the right one, if I could make someone stay. "But they're not William," I said. "And keeping them doesn't bring him back. It just spreads the grief around." For a moment, I thought she was going to attack me. Her impossibly long arms tensed, and I saw claws extending from her fingertips. But then she crumpled, folding in on herself like a broken umbrella. "I'm so tired," she said. "I'm so tired of waiting." "Then stop waiting," I said. "Let him go. Let yourself go." She looked at me with those black, whole eyes, and for just a moment I saw the woman she had been before grief consumed her. Young, hopeful, in love with a boy who promised to come home from war. "Will you tell him I waited?" she asked. "If I ever see him, I'll tell him," I promised. She smiled then, the first genuine expression I'd seen from her. It transformed her face completely, showing me the beauty that had been hidden under layers of sorrow. "Thank you," she said. Then she began to fade, becoming transparent like morning mist. As she dissolved, I heard her voice one last time, but now it was peaceful, relieved. "I can rest now." When she was gone completely, I climbed up to the ledge where the victims lay. The bodies were all there: Tom Bradley, Mike Chen, David Ross, Peterson and Morrison. But they weren't frozen or damaged. They looked like they were sleeping peacefully, finally released from whatever hold she'd had on them. It took me 2 days to get all the bodies down from that cliff, and I never did find a way to explain what had really happened. The official report listed it as climbing accidents and helicopter mechanical failure. Sometimes the truth is too strange for paperwork. The Park Service closed Widow's Peak to technical climbing after that, citing unstable rock conditions and unpredictable weather patterns. The families of the victims were told their loved ones died doing what they loved in one of the most beautiful places in Virginia. It was true enough as far as it went. I took extended leave after the incident, spent most of the summer with Sarah and the boys. When our 4th son was born in June, we named him William. I never told Sarah why I picked that name, but sometimes I catch her looking at me like she knows there's more to the story. I worked with the Cherokee Tribal Council to establish a proper memorial for the 7 women who died on the peak in 1867. It's a simple stone marker placed where the climbing trail begins, with their names and a single line. They waited with love. The grief that consumed that woman for over a century taught me something important about loss and love and letting go. Grief is just love with nowhere to go, my grandmother used to say. The trick is finding a way to honor that love without letting it consume you. I went back to work after my leave ended, but I never quite looked at these mountains the same way. There are places where strong emotions leave marks, where human experiences echo across decades or centuries. Widow's Peak isn't the only one. There are other peaks in these mountains where hikers report strange encounters, unexplained phenomena, voices calling from empty ridgelines. Most of the time these places are harmless. Most of the time the echoes are faint and fade quickly. But sometimes when the pain is deep enough and the love is strong enough, those echoes can become something more solid, something that walks around looking for resolution that might never come. I still patrol these mountains, still guide rescue operations and track lost hikers, but now I listen more carefully to the local legends, pay attention to the stories the Cherokee elders tell about places where the past won't quite let go of the present. And sometimes, on clear mornings when the mist is rising off the peaks, I think I hear her voice one last time. Not calling for William anymore, not crying with that terrible grief, but singing softly to herself. A lullaby maybe, or a wedding song from a time when the future seemed full of promise. She found her peace, finally. Found a way to let go of the love that had become her prison. But these mountains remember everything, and somewhere in that memory, a young woman in a white dress is still waiting for her soldier to come home from war. The difference is, now she's waiting with joy instead of sorrow, knowing that love doesn't end just because life does, knowing that some promises transcend death and some reunions are worth waiting a lifetime for. I just hope she doesn't have to wait much longer. My name is Bobby Mackenzie and I've been a park ranger for 13 years now. That might not sound like much, but when you're dealing with abandoned mines in the Allegheny Mountains, 13 years means you've seen things most people wouldn't believe. I grew up here in western Pennsylvania, where my grandfather worked the copper mines back in the day. When the mines shut down in the 60s, a lot of families left for the cities. I stayed. Someone had to keep an eye on these old holes in the ground, make sure kids didn't fall in and die. It was September 1979 when everything changed. The leaves were just starting to turn, and there was that crisp smell in the air that always reminded me of going back to school. I was sitting in my ranger station about 25 miles outside Pittsburgh when the call came in. We got some college kids missing out at Copper Hollow. Dispatch crackled through the radio. Urban explorers. One of them might have fallen in the old shaft. I knew Copper Hollow well. It was the biggest mine complex in our district, shut down since 1962. The entrance was supposed to be sealed, but kids always found ways to get inside. I'd pulled 3 bodies out of there in my time as a ranger. The place was a death trap. Flooded tunnels, unstable ground, bad air. I loaded up my truck with rescue gear and headed out. The mine sat in a valley surrounded by stripped hills where they'd taken the earth apart looking for copper. It was ugly country now, all torn up and scarred. But it paid good money back when my grandfather was young. As I drove the winding road down into the hollow, I thought about my own daughter, Sarah. She was 9 now, living with her mother in Pittsburgh since the divorce. I barely saw her anymore. The job kept me too busy, and the child support took most of my pay. Maybe that's why I worked so hard to keep other people's kids safe. It was easier than dealing with my own failures as a father. The college kid's car was parked near the old mine entrance, a beat-up Volkswagen van with peace signs painted on it. I could see where they'd pried the boards off the sealed opening. Kids these days had no respect for danger. I grabbed my flashlight and safety equipment and walked over to the hole. It was dark inside, darker than it should have been for 2 in the afternoon. The air coming out smelled wrong, not just the usual dampness and decay, but something else, something sweet and metallic. "Hello," I called into the darkness. "This is Park Ranger Mackenzie. If anyone's in there, call out." My voice echoed back, but there was something strange about the echo. It sounded like there were more voices mixed in with mine. Smaller voices. I shook my head. I've been working these mines too long. They could play tricks on your ears. But as I stood there listening, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Singing, faint and far away, coming from deep in the mighty children's voices, singing an old song I remembered from when I was little. "Down in the mine, where the copper shines bright, we work all day and we work all night." It was an old mining song, the kind workers used to sing to keep time. But no kids today would know those words. Hell, most adults didn't know them either. I checked my equipment one more time and clicked on my headlamp. Whatever was down there, lost college kids or something else, I had a job to do. People were counting on me to bring them out safe. As I stepped into the mine entrance, the temperature dropped 20 degrees. My breath came out in little puffs of mist. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, those thin voices kept singing their ancient song. The main tunnel sloped down into the mountain, following the old copper vein. My headlamp beam cut through the darkness, showing rough-hewn walls stained green and black from decades of water seepage. The railroad tracks that once carried ore cars were still there, rusted and broken in places. I'd been in this mine before, but never this deep. Usually, kids got lost or hurt near the entrance. The deeper tunnels were supposed to be flooded and impassable. "Hello," I called again. "Can anyone hear me?" This time I got an answer. A weak voice from somewhere ahead. "Help! Please help us!" I moved faster, following the tracks deeper into the mountain. The singing had stopped, but I could hear water dripping and the occasional creak of old timber supports. The air was getting thicker, harder to breathe. My metal detector started beeping like crazy. The needle was jumping all over the place, picking up massive amounts of copper in the walls. That was normal for this mine, but I'd never seen readings this high. It was like the very rocks were made of pure metal. After about 10 minutes of walking, I reached a side tunnel I'd never seen before. It wasn't on any of the maps I'd studied. The entrance was barely big enough for a grown man to squeeze through, but I could see light flickering inside. Candlelight. "In here!" the voice called. "We're trapped!" I got down on my hands and knees and crawled through the opening. On the other side was a small chamber, maybe 10 feet square. 2 college kids, a boy and a girl, both about 20, were huddled against the far wall. They looked scared out of their minds. "Thank God," the girl whispered. We thought we were going to die down here." "What happened?" I asked, checking them for injuries. "How did you get separated from your friends?" "There were 5 of us," the boy said. His name was Mike, and he was studying geology at Pitt. "We were exploring the main tunnel when we heard voices, children's voices, singing. Sarah wanted to investigate." "Sarah's not here," the girl added quickly. "Her name was Linda. She went deeper into the mine. We tried to follow her, but then the tunnel collapsed behind us. We've been trapped here for hours." I looked back at the entrance I'd just crawled through. It was clear and open. "What collapsed tunnel?" They both stared at me like I was crazy. "The one behind you," Mike said. "It's blocked with rocks and timber. We couldn't get out." I turned around and shined my light at the opening. Nothing but clear tunnel. "There's no collapse here. This is how I got in." The 2 kids looked at each other with growing terror. "That's impossible," Linda whispered. "The tunnel's been blocked for hours. We saw it happen." A chill ran down my spine. Something was very wrong here. I'd seen enough mine accidents to know what a real collapse looked like, and there was no debris anywhere. "Where did you get the candles?" I asked, looking at the flickering flames around the chamber. "What candles?" Mike said. I looked again. There were no candles. The chamber was lit only by my headlamp, but I'd seen light when I approached. I was sure of it. "We need to get out of here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Right now!" As we crawled back through the opening, Linda grabbed my arm. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I stopped and listened. From somewhere deeper in the mine came the sound of pickaxes hitting stone, the steady rhythm of miners at work. But these mines had been empty for 17 years, and mixed in with the pickaxe sounds were voices, small voices calling for help. "Daddy! Daddy, where are you?" "It's too dark down here." "I want to go home." The voices of children, lost and scared in the darkness. Mike was shaking. "Those are the voices we heard before, the ones that led us down here." I'd heard enough ghost stories growing up in mining country. Every old-timer had tales about spirits in the tunnels, miners who died in cave-ins and couldn't find their way out, but I'd always figured they were just stories. As we made our way back toward the main tunnel, my equipment started acting up again. The metal detector was screaming, and my radio was picking up strange interference. Voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize, mixed with bursts of static. Then we saw the footprints, small footprints in the mine dust leading deeper into the mountain. Child-sized prints, but wearing old-fashioned boots, the kind miners wore in my grandfather's time. "Those weren't there before," Linda said, her voice barely a whisper. The prints were fresh. I could tell by the way the dust had settled. Someone, or something, had walked this way recently. But there were no children in this mine. There couldn't be. As we reached the main tunnel, a new sound echoed from the depths, the squeak and rattle of an ore cart moving along the tracks, getting closer. "Run!" I said. "Now!" We stumbled toward the entrance as fast as we could, but the sound followed us. The cart was gaining ground, though I never saw what was pushing it. All I could hear were those voices again, calling out in the darkness. "Don't!
Leave us, Daddy. We're still down here. Help us find our way home." We burst out of the mine into the fading daylight, gasping and shaking. The college kids collapsed on the ground, too scared to speak. But as I looked back at the mine entrance, I saw something that made my blood freeze. Small handprints in the copper dust around the opening. Dozens of them, like children, had been pressing their hands against the walls, trying to get out. And somewhere deep in the mountain, I could still hear them singing. I called in backup and a full rescue team. If there really was a girl named Sarah still down there, we needed to find her fast. But as more rangers arrived, things got stranger. Nobody else could hear the singing. "You sure you're feeling okay, Bobby?" asked Tom Russell, my supervisor. "Maybe you've been working too hard." I wanted to believe he was right. But then our rescue team found something that changed everything. In a side chamber about half a mile into the mine, we discovered a pile of old equipment. Pickaxes, shovels and mining helmets, all child-sized. The metal was green with age and the wooden handles were rotted, but they looked like they'd been used recently. "This stuff's got to be from the 20s, said Jim Crawford, our mining historian. "Back when they used child labour in these places." He picked up one of the small pickaxes and examined it. "Jesus, Bobby, look at this." The handle was worn smooth where small hands had gripped it, and there were dark stains on the metal head that looked suspiciously like blood. "How many kids work these mines?" I asked. Jim's face was grim. "Records are spotty, but probably dozens. It was legal back then, if you can believe that. Kids as young as 6 years old, working 12-hour shifts in the dark. What happened to them? Most grew up and moved away, but there were accidents." He trailed off, pulling out a folder of old newspaper clippings. "Here, September 15th, 1923. Mine collapse kills 23 children. 23 kids died when a support tunnel caved in. They were working a new copper vein when it happened." I felt sick. 23 children buried alive in these tunnels. No wonder the place felt wrong. As night fell, we set up floodlights and continued the search for the missing college student. But the deeper we went, the more impossible things became. Our equipment kept malfunctioning, radios picked up voices speaking in old-fashioned English, metal detectors went haywire. And twice, team members reported seeing small figures moving in the shadows just beyond the light. The worst incident happened around midnight. Dave Phillips, our youngest team member, was checking a side tunnel when we heard him scream. We found him 20 minutes later, huddled in a corner and sobbing like a child. When we got him back to the surface, he kept talking in a strange, old-fashioned way. "Please, mister," he
said in a voice much higher than his normal tone. "I don't want to go back down there. It's too dark and the walls are falling. My mama needs me to come home." Dr. Morgan, the team medic, said Dave was in some kind of shock. But it wasn't normal shock. He was acting exactly like a scared child from the 1920s. "Dave," I said gently, "what did you see down there?" His eyes focused on me with a clarity that was somehow worse than the confusion. "They want their daddy to come get them," he whispered. "They've been waiting so long for their daddy to come." That's when I started to understand. These weren't just any ghosts. They were the children who died in the 1923 collapse, and they were looking for their fathers to rescue them. Around 2 a.m. I made a decision that probably saved our lives. I ordered everyone out of the mine. "But we haven't found the girl yet," Tom protested. "There is no girl," I said. "The college kids were confused, probably affected by bad air. We're dealing with something else down there." As we packed up our gear, I heard the singing again. Louder this time, and closer to the entrance. All those small voices joined together. "Daddy, please don't leave us here, in the dark so cold and drear. Find us for the morning light. Save us from eternal night." I was the last one to leave the mine entrance. As I walked away, I looked back and saw them. 23 small figures standing in the mouth of the tunnel, watching me go. They were covered in copper dust and rock debris, and their faces were pale as moonlight. Some carried the tiny mining tools we'd found. Others just stood there with their hands outstretched, like children asking to be picked up. The youngest looked about 6 years old, the oldest maybe 14. All of them had the hollow, desperate eyes of kids who'd been waiting far too long for someone to come help them. I wanted to run, but something kept me rooted in place. One of the children stepped forward, a boy about 10 wearing overalls and a cloth cap. He looked exactly like the old photographs I'd seen of my grandfather as a child. The boy opened his mouth and spoke in a voice like wind through broken timber. "Why won't you help us, Bobby? We've been calling for so long." My grandfather's name had been Robert Mackenzie too. He would have been 10 years old in 1923. The ghost child smiled sadly and pointed back into the mine. "Your little girl is down there with us now. She came looking for her daddy." My heart stopped. "Sarah? My daughter Sarah is here." "She's been here all along," the boy said, "waiting for you to come get her, just like we've been waiting." Then all 23 children turned and walked back into the darkness, their small forms fading like mist. I knew it was impossible. Sarah was safe in Pittsburgh with her mother. But as I stood there in the cold mountain air, I could hear her voice joining the ancient song from somewhere deep underground. And I knew I had to go back in. I went back into the mine alone against every regulation in the book. But this wasn't about regulations anymore. This was about children who'd been lost in the dark for over 50 years, and somehow my own daughter had become part of their endless wait. The tunnels were different now. Passages that had been blocked were open, and new routes had appeared that weren't on any map. The children were changing the mine, rearranging it like a puzzle to lead me where they wanted me to go. My equipment was useless. The flashlight beam kept dimming and flickering, and my radio was silent except for occasional bursts of that eerie singing. But I could see well enough. The walls themselves seemed to glow with a faint copper light, showing me the way. I followed the main tunnel for what felt like hours, going deeper than I'd ever been before. The temperature kept dropping until my breath came out in white clouds, and gradually I became aware that I wasn't alone. Small footsteps echoed mine, staying just out of sight. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, a child-sized shadow ducking behind a support beam or around a corner. They were escorting me, making sure I didn't get lost. Finally, I reached a vast chamber I'd never seen before. It was huge, maybe 100 feet across, with old mining equipment scattered around the edges. Rusty ore carts, coils of rope, and wooden ladders that crumbled if you looked at them too hard. In the center of the chamber was a pile of rubble, rocks and broken timbers from a cave-in that happened decades ago. And sitting on top of the pile, barely visible in the dim light, was my daughter, Sarah. She looked exactly as I remembered her from our last visit. Pigtails, gap-toothed smile, wearing the blue dress her mother had bought her for school pictures. But her skin was pale as candle wax, and when she turned to look at me, her eyes were the deep black of underground water. "Daddy!" she called, just like she always did when I came to pick her up. "I've been waiting for you." My heart was breaking. This wasn't my real daughter. Couldn't be. But she looked so much like Sarah that I wanted to run to her, scoop her up and carry her out of this nightmare place. "You're not Sarah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "My daughter is safe at home." The thing that looked like my daughter tilted her head with that curious expression Sarah always made when she didn't understand something. "But Daddy, I am Sarah. Don't you remember? You brought me here to see where Grandpa used to work." That hit me like a punch to the stomach. I had promised Sarah I'd bring her to see the old mine someday, when she was older. It was one of those vague parent promises you make to get kids to stop asking questions. "I've been down here so long," she continued, her voice starting to echo in ways that hurt my ears, playing with all the other children but we can't find our way out. The tunnels keep changing. Around the edges of the chamber, other shapes were moving. The 23 children from the 1923 accident emerging from the shadows like they'd been there all along. They formed a circle around the rubble pile, all of them looking at me with those same black, desperate eyes. "We just want to go home, mister," said a little girl with copper dust in her hair. "But we can't leave without our daddies." "Where are our daddies?" asked a boy who couldn't have been more than 7. "They promised they'd come get us when the work was done." I understood then what had really happened in 1923. These children hadn't just died in an accident. They'd died waiting for rescue that never came. Their fathers had been trapped in other parts of the mine, probably killed in the same collapse. The children had been alone in the dark, calling for help until the very end. And now they were trying to collect surrogate fathers to replace the ones they'd lost. "Your fathers can't come," I told them as gently as I could. "They died a long time ago, just like you did. But you don't have to stay here anymore. You can go on to wherever they are." The children looked at each other with confusion and growing anger. The temperature in the chamber dropped even further. "No!" Sarah, or the thing wearing Sarah's face, screamed. "We're not dead. We're just lost. And you're going to help us find our way home." The pile of rubble began to shift and move. Rocks tumbled down as something huge stirred underneath. Something that had been crushed and buried for decades but wasn't ready to rest. I realized with horror that the children weren't the only spirits trapped in this mine. The collapse that killed them had created something else. A massive, angry presence made up of all their fear and pain and desperate need for rescue. The chamber walls began to crack and groan. Dust and small stones rained down from the ceiling. If I didn't get out soon, I'd be buried alive, just like they were, but I couldn't leave them. Not again. These children had been abandoned once by adults who were supposed to protect them. I wouldn't let it happen again. "Listen to me," I said, spreading my arms wide to address all of them. "I know you're scared and you want to go home. I know it's been dark and lonely down here for so long, but holding on to that pain isn't helping you. You have to let go." The thing under the rubble roared, a sound like grinding stone and screaming metal. "Your fathers loved you," I continued, raising my voice over the noise. "They would have saved you if they could, but they're gone now and so are you. The only way to be with them again is to stop fighting and move on." Sarah's face was changing, becoming less like my daughter and more like something ancient and hungry. "But we need our daddy. We need someone to take care of us." "You don't need me to take care of you," I said. "You need to take care of each other. You've been together all this time. You're a family now, and families help each other find their way home." The children looked at each other uncertainly. For the first time since I'd entered the mine, their desperate hunger seemed to ease. "Will you help us?" asked the boy who looked like my grandfather. "Show us how to leave this place?" I nodded, even as the ceiling continued to crack above us. "Take each other's hands, hold tight and don't let go. Think about the light, not the darkness. Remember what it felt like to be safe." One by one, the children joined hands in a circle around the rubble pile. As they did, their forms began to glow with a soft, warm light that had nothing to do with copper or metal. It was the light of memory, of love that survived even death. The thing under the rubble gave one last furious roar, then crumbled into dust and silence. And Sarah, my false Sarah, smiled at me one final time before fading away like morning mist. "Thank you, Daddy," she whispered. "Now you can go home too." I woke up outside the mine entrance with the sunrise warming my face and my rescue team shouting my name. According to them, I'd been missing for 6 hours. They'd been afraid I was dead. "What the hell were you thinking going in there alone?" Tom demanded as the medic checked me over. "You could have been killed." I tried to tell them what had happened, but the words sounded crazy even to me. Ghost children and a conversation with the dead? They figured I'd been overcome by bad air and hallucinated the whole thing. Maybe they were right. Maybe it had all been in my head. But 2 weeks later, when the State Mining Commission came to do a final survey before permanently sealing the mine, they found something interesting. In the chamber where the 1923 accident had occurred, the rubble pile had somehow been cleared away. Underneath, they discovered the remains of 23 children, along with several adults who'd apparently died trying to rescue them. The bodies were properly buried at last, with headstones bearing their names in the Copper Hollow Cemetery. The whole community came out for the service, descendants of mining families who'd wondered for decades what happened to their lost relatives. I was there too, standing in the back with my daughter, my real daughter. After my experience in the mine, I'd finally gotten the courage to call my ex-wife and ask for a real relationship with Sarah. We were taking it slow, but she was spending weekends with me now. We were learning to be a family again. During the burial service, Sarah tugged on my sleeve. "Daddy, who are all those children you told me about? The ones who got lost in the mine?" I'd told her an edited version of the story, just enough to explain why the ceremony was important. "They were kids who died a long time ago," I said. "But their families never knew what happened to them. Now they can rest." Sarah nodded seriously. At 9 years old, she understood loss better than most adults. Her parents' divorce had taught her that sometimes people you love go away. "Do you think they found their daddies?" she asked. I looked at the rows of small headstones, each one marking a life cut far too short. But somehow, standing there in the warm sunlight with my daughter's hand in mine, I believed they had. "Yeah," I said. "I think they did." The mine was sealed permanently the next month. I transferred to a different district, one without quite so much tragic history. But sometimes, on quiet autumn evenings when the wind blows through the mountains, I swear I can still hear them singing. Not the desperate, hungry song they sang in the darkness. A different song now, lighter, happier. The sound of children at play, safe at last. I never go near abandoned mines anymore unless absolutely necessary. But other rangers in the district tell me strange stories, equipment that moves by itself, small handprints in the dust, and sometimes, very rarely, the sound of children laughing somewhere deep underground. I tell them it's just their imagination. Old mines play tricks on your mind, I say. The darkness and isolation can make you hear things that aren't there. But I know better now. Some places hold on to memory, like copper holds on to heat. And sometimes, if you listen carefully enough, you can hear the echoes of lives that ended too soon. The children of Copper Hollow found their way home at last. But they left something behind, a reminder that the dead don't always rest easy, especially when they died, calling for help that never came. I try to be a better father now. I spend time with Sarah, really spend time with her, because I learned something important in those dark tunnels. Children need to know their parents will come for them, no matter what, even if it takes 50 years, even if it's impossible, even if it costs everything you have. The mine is quiet now, but I still carry the memory of those lost voices and the promise I made in the darkness. Sometimes love is stronger than death, and sometimes the only way to lay the past to rest is to face it head on. The children are at peace now, and so, finally, am I.